They found him in the snow, not kneeling, not begging, just standing there in the courtyard of Blackthorn Keep with blood on his hands and ice in his eyes, watching the nobles who had come to strip him of everything he'd ever built. The northern wind cut through the fortress like a blade, and Duke Cedric Ravenscar, the man who had made kings nervous and enemies disappear, stood perfectly still while the royal inquisitor read the charges that would end his reign. Treason, conspiracy, the systematic elimination of rivals under the pretense of justice. 37 documented kills, maybe more. The evidence had been building for years, whispered in council chambers and hidden in blood-stained ledgers, and now it had finally reached the crown. They had come for him at dawn with 200 soldiers and a warrant signed by the king himself. But here's what nobody expected. Cedric didn't run, didn't fight. He just stood there with that terrible calm that made even the inquisitor's voice crack when he announced the sentence. Exile. Confiscation of titles. The dismantling of House Ravenscar brick by brick until nothing remained but stories. Mothers would tell their children about the monster who once ruled the North. And through it all, Cedric watched them with eyes that had stopped pretending to feel anything years ago. And you have to wonder what it takes to hollow out a man so completely that even his own destruction looks like just another Tuesday. Stay with this, because what happens next isn't about redemption. It's about what a person becomes when they've got nothing left to lose except the last shred of humanity they didn't know they still had. And that's when the real story starts. The fortress emptied like blood from a wound. Cedric stood at the eastern tower window and watched the servants flee. 36 households had served Ravenscar for generations, and now they scattered into the valley like rats abandoning a sinking warship. He didn't blame them. Loyalty was a luxury you couldn't afford when your employer's name became synonymous with death. The Inquisitor had given him 72 hours to vacate the premises. 72 hours to pack up 38 years of existence and disappear into whatever hole the crown deemed appropriate for fallen nobility. After that, Blackthorn would be razed. Every stone scattered, every banner burned. They wanted to erase him so thoroughly that future generations would question whether he'd existed at all. Fine. He'd been erasing himself for years anyway. The door opened without ceremony. Marcus Thorne entered, still wearing his captain's insignia, even though technically he no longer had anyone to command. The man was 63, built like a bear that had survived too many winters, and had followed Cedric through enough bloodshed to fill several lifetimes. "You're still here," Cedric said without turning around. Marcus crossed to the table where a half-empty bottle of Grenshire whiskey sat next to a map of the Northern Territories. "Got nowhere better to be. They're hunting anyone who stays loyal." "You know that. I know you didn't do half the things they're accusing you of." Cedric finally turned from the window. His face was all sharp angles and hollow spaces, the kind of face that looked carved rather than born. Just half. Marcus poured himself a drink without asking permission. The Westerbrook Massacre. The disappearance of Lord Fenwick's daughter. The fire that killed 18 people in that grain warehouse. He met Cedric's eyes without flinching. "You didn't order those. Someone's been building a case for years, planting evidence, buying witnesses. This whole thing stinks like a setup. Doesn't matter now." "The hell it doesn't." Marcus slammed the glass down hard enough to crack it. "You're going to walk away after everything you built? After every sacrifice you made to keep this territory from tearing itself apart?" Cedric moved to the fireplace where flames gnawed at oak logs that had been cut from Ravenscar land by men who'd probably already forgotten his name. "Watch carefully, Marcus. This is what power looks like when you strip away all the ceremony and bullshit. It's nothing, just a title on parchment and a building full of rocks. I spent 2 decades thinking I was building something permanent, and it turns out I was just rearranging furniture in a house that never belonged to me in the first place. So that's it? You're just done. What would you have me do? Storm the Capitol with an army I don't have? Assassinate the king and prove every accusation right? The game's over. I lost. The smart move is accepting that before I lose anything else." "Like what?" Marcus's voice dropped low. "You've got no family, no heirs, no friends except the ones stupid enough to still show up after the arrest warrant. What else is there to lose?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Cedric stared into the fire and saw faces he'd tried very hard to forget. His father, dead at 42 from a heart that gave out under the weight of maintaining Ravenscar prestige. His mother, who'd smiled at state dinners while slowly poisoning herself with wine and laudanum. His younger brother, who'd put a pistol in his mouth rather than face another year of living in Cedric's shadow. A parade of ghosts built from the rubble of a family that had confused cruelty with strength for so many generations they'd forgotten there was supposed to be a difference. "There's always something left to lose," he said quietly. "That's the real trap. You think you've sacrificed everything, cut away every weakness, turned yourself into something that can't be hurt anymore. And then you find out there's still one more piece of yourself left to destroy." Before Marcus could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Both men tensed automatically, hands moving toward weapons that had become extensions of their bodies after years of survival. But the knock that followed was soft, almost hesitant. "Enter," Cedric called. The door opened to reveal a young woman dressed in traveling clothes that had seen better days. Her hair was dark brown, pulled back severely from a face that might have been beautiful if it wasn't currently occupied with barely suppressed fury. She carried a leather satchel over one shoulder and had the posture of someone who'd learned to walk through hostile territory without apologizing for taking up space. Cedric didn't recognize her immediately. Then he saw the silver pendant at her throat, a hawk in flight, wings spread, and something cold settled in his chest. "Lady Alara Fennec," he said, "I thought you'd left with everyone else." Her green eyes were sharp enough to cut. "I thought about it. Then I remembered I have questions that need answering before I let you disappear into whatever exile the crown has planned." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "My lady, now's really not the time." "It's exactly the time." She stepped fully into the room and kicked the door shut behind her. "Because in 3 days this place gets demolished, and everyone scatters, and the truth dies with it. So forgive me if I'm not particularly interested in respecting your schedule, Captain." Cedric studied her with the same clinical detachment he'd used to evaluate threats for years. "Alara Fennec, 26 years old, daughter of Lord Edmund Fennec, who'd vanished 7 years ago under circumstances that had never been adequately explained. She'd inherited her father's seat on the Territorial Council and had spent the last 5 years making Cedric's political life significantly more complicated by asking uncomfortable questions at every opportunity. She was also one of approximately 6 people in the entire northern province who'd never seemed afraid of him. "You want to know if I killed your father?" he said flatly. "I want to know the truth." "There's a difference, is there?" Alara dropped her satchel on the table next to the whiskey bottle. "I've spent 7 years investigating his disappearance. 7 years following every rumor, bribing every informant, digging through archives that hadn't been opened in decades. And you want to know what I found? Enlighten me. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No body, no witnesses, no paper trail. My father was one of the most prominent lords in the territory, and he vanished like smoke." She leaned forward, knuckles white against the table edge. "But here's what's interesting. Every single person who might have had information about what happened to him, they're dead. Carriage accidents, sudden illnesses. One poor bastard fell off his own roof. And every single death can be traced back to someone in your network." Cedric felt Marcus tense beside him, but kept his own face carefully neutral. "That's a serious accusation. It's a serious pattern." She pulled a folded document from her jacket. "I've got names, dates, connections. Enough circumstantial evidence to build a compelling case that you systematically eliminated anyone who knew the truth about Edmund Fennec's final days." "Then why didn't you present this evidence to the Inquisitor?" "Because I'm not an idiot?" She slammed the paper down. "Half the charges against you are fabricated. I can smell a frame-up from a mile away. And this whole thing reeks of political maneuvering. Someone wanted you gone, and they built a case using just enough truth to make it believable." She met his eyes with an intensity that reminded him uncomfortably of her father. "So before you vanish and I lose my last chance at answers, I'm asking directly, did you kill Edmund Fennec?" The fire crackled. Outside, the wind howled through the empty fortress like the ghost of everything Cedric had tried to build. Marcus was watching him carefully, waiting to see how he'd play this. And Cedric realized he was tired. Tired of the calculations, tired of the masks, tired of carrying secrets that had turned toxic years ago, but still had to be protected because the alternative was worse. "No," he said simply, "I didn't kill your father." "Then where is he?" "Dead. Probably. But not by my hand." Alara's jaw tightened. "Then whose? That's complicated. Uncomplicated." Cedric poured himself a drink and downed it in one motion, feeling the burn spread through his chest like absolution he didn't deserve. Your father discovered something he shouldn't have. Evidence of corruption in the Crown's administration. Illegal land seizures, falsified tax records, assassination orders signed by people close to the king himself. He brought it to me because he thought I had the power to do something about it. And I told him to bury it, to forget he'd ever seen it, and get back to managing his estates like a good little lord. Why? Because I knew exactly what would happen if he went public. Cedric refilled his glass. The Crown would deny everything. They'd destroy the evidence. They'd ruin his reputation. And then they'd make an example of him to ensure nobody else got similar ideas. I was trying to save his life. Clearly that worked out well. He didn't listen. Of course he didn't. Edmund Fenwick was a lot of things, but obedient wasn't one of them. She had her father's spine, all right. He took his evidence to a journalist in the capital, someone he thought he could trust. 3 weeks later, he sent me a message saying he'd made a terrible mistake and needed help. By the time I got there, he was already gone. Gone where? I don't know. The journalist was dead, the evidence had vanished, and your father had disappeared so completely it was like he'd never existed. Cedric turned to face her fully. I spent 6 months trying to find him, used every resource I had, called in every favor, threatened people I shouldn't have threatened. Nothing. Eventually, I had to accept that he was either dead or so deep underground that he might as well be. And the people who died, the ones whose deaths connect back to you, were silenced by someone who wanted to make sure the investigation never gained traction. Someone with enough power to eliminate witnesses and enough intelligence to make it look like I was responsible. He paused. I think the same people who made your father disappear are the ones who just destroyed my life. They've been planning this for years, and I was too arrogant to see it coming. Elara was silent for a long moment, processing. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but no less intense. Why should I believe you? Because I've got nothing left to lie for. Cedric gestured at the empty fortress around them. In 3 days, I'll be nobody. No title, no power, no reason for anyone to care what I say. This is probably the only honest conversation I've had in a decade. She studied him with those sharp green eyes that saw too much. My father trusted you. I found letters. He wrote about you like you were the only person in the Northern Territory who understood what needed to change. Like you were actually trying to build something better instead of just maintaining the same corrupt system everyone else benefited from. Your father was an idealist in a world designed to eat idealists alive. And what are you? A pragmatist who just found out that pragmatism and cowardice look remarkably similar from certain angles. Marcus cleared his throat. If you're both done with the philosophical discussion, we've got a more immediate problem. He nodded toward the window. Company's arriving. Cedric crossed to look. In the valley below, a column of riders approached Blackthorn Keep. Even from this distance, he could make out the crimson cloaks of Crown Guard and the black banners of the Inquisition. They're early, Marcus said grimly. Guess they're not big on giving people the full 72 hours. Elara moved beside Cedric to peer down at the approaching force. That's not a standard patrol. That's an execution detail. What? She pointed at the formation. See the way they're moving? Tight ranks, heavy weapons, no supply wagons. They're not here to escort you into exile. She turned to Cedric. They're here to make sure you never leave this fortress alive. Cedric felt something shift in his chest. Not fear, exactly. More like recognition. Of course. Why waste time with a trial or a messy exile when you could stage a convenient accident? Former Duke resists arrest, gets killed in the resulting confrontation, problem solved. Clean, efficient. The kind of solution he would have approved of back when he was the one making these decisions. Well, he said quietly, I suppose that's one way to finish the story. Like hell. Marcus was already moving toward the weapons rack. We can hold them off long enough to get you out through the mountain passage. There's still loyalists in the territory who'd hide you. And then what? Cedric didn't move from the window. I spend the rest of my life running, living like a fugitive while the Crown hunts me down? That's not survival, Marcus. That's just a slower execution. So you're going to stand here and let them kill you? Elara's voice cracked with something that might have been actual concern. After everything you just told me? After admitting that someone's been setting you up for years? What choice do I have? You fight? She grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. You fight because there are people who deserve to know the truth. Because my father died trying to expose corruption. And if you die here, His death meant nothing, because someone powerful enough to frame a duke and make an entire noble house disappear is still out there, and you're the only person who knows enough to bring them down. Cedric looked at her hand on his arm. No one had touched him voluntarily in years. People kept their distance, maintained the careful space that fear required. But Alara Fennec was gripping him like he was a rope that could pull her father back from whatever grave he'd fallen into. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe he'd spent so long being the person everyone feared that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be someone worth saving. The riders were closer now. 5 minutes, maybe less. He looked at Marcus, who'd grabbed a sword and was checking the edge with professional efficiency. Then at Alara, whose green eyes burned with determination that reminded him painfully of Edmund Fennec's last message begging for help. Then at the fortress around him, empty and echoing, already a monument to everything he'd built and lost. "There's a passage," he said slowly, "behind the wine cellar. Leads to a cave system that comes out 3 miles north." He pulled a ring from his finger, heavy gold stamped with the Raven Scar seal. "Give this to a woman named Sylvie in the town of Millbrook. She'll help you disappear." Alara took the ring, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about you getting out of here before you end up dead alongside me. I'm not leaving." "Yes, you are." Cedric's voice went cold, slipping back into the tone that had commanded armies. "Your father spent his last days trying to expose the truth. Someone should survive to finish what he started. That's not going to be me. I'm too compromised, too marked. But you? You're nobody's primary target yet. You've got a chance. I don't want a chance. I want answers. Then stay alive long enough to find them." He pushed her toward the door. "Marcus will get you out. Take whatever evidence you've collected and find someone who can actually use it. Someone who isn't standing in a condemned fortress waiting for an execution squad." She resisted, surprisingly strong. "And what happens to you?" Cedric smiled, and it was the saddest expression Marcus had ever seen on his commander's face. "I pay for 38 years of being exactly the person everyone always said I was." Before Alara could argue further, Marcus grabbed her other arm. "My lady, we need to move. Now." She wrenched free. "I'm not abandoning someone to die just because they're suicidal enough to think they deserve it. It's not about deserving." Cedric was already moving toward the weapons rack, selecting a sword that had seen him through a dozen battles. "It's about mathematics. They need me dead to keep their secrets safe." "Fine. Let them come. But they don't need you dead yet, which means you're valuable alive. Don't waste that advantage by dying for someone who stopped mattering years ago." "That's not true, isn't it?" He turned on her with sudden ferocity. "I've spent 2 decades making decisions that turned me into exactly the kind of monster they're accusing me of being. Maybe not the specific crimes, but close enough. I've ordered executions. I've destroyed families. I've sacrificed people I should have protected because I convinced myself the ends justified the means." He gestured at the approaching soldiers. "So maybe this is just the universe collecting a debt I've owed for a long time." Alara stared at him. "My father died believing you were better than this. Then your father was wrong about a lot of things." The words hit harder than he intended. Alara's face went pale, and for a moment she looked very young and very lost. Then she straightened, shoulders going back in a gesture of pure defiance he recognized from every argument they'd had in council chambers. "Fine," she said. "Die here if that's what your guilt demands. But I'm not running either." "Alara," she cut him off. "I've spent 7 years chasing ghosts. 7 years being the crazy woman obsessed with a father everyone else forgot. And now the one person who might actually have answers is planning a dramatic suicide because he thinks he doesn't deserve to live?" "No." She grabbed her satchel. "If you're staying, I'm staying. If we die, we die. But at least we die trying to finish what my father started instead of rolling over for the people who killed him." Marcus looked between them like they'd both lost their minds, which maybe they had. Then he sighed heavily and picked up a second sword. "Well, if we're doing this, we should probably have a plan that's slightly more sophisticated than standing around waiting to get shot." Cedric felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not hope, exactly. More like the ghost of a feeling he'd thought was dead. The sense that maybe there was still something worth fighting for that wasn't about power or control or survival. Maybe just the simple idea that some truths were too important to die with. He looked at the approaching soldiers, looked at Marcus, who'd followed him into hell more times than either of them could count. Looked at Alara Fennec, who had every reason to want him dead, and was instead standing beside him because she believed truth mattered more than revenge. "All right," he said, "here's what we do." The wine cellar was a labyrinth of stone corridors and ancient storage rooms carved deep into Blackthorn's foundations. Cedric led them down narrow stairs, worn smooth by centuries of servants carrying barrels, their footsteps echoing against walls that sweated moisture and history. Marcus brought up the rear, sword drawn, listening for sounds of pursuit. How long before they realize you're not waiting politely in your chambers? 10 minutes if they're thorough, 5 if they're not. Cedric pushed through a heavy wooden door into a chamber lined with wine racks holding bottles that were older than most kingdoms. He moved to the far wall and pressed a specific stone that looked identical to 50 others. A section of wall swung inward with a grinding sound like bones breaking. "Dramatic," Alara observed. "My ancestors believed in making everything complicated." Cedric pulled a torch from the wall sconce. "It's a tunnel that connects to the old mining caves. Comes out at... I know where it comes out." She was already studying the passage with the same intensity she'd brought to every territorial survey she'd ever conducted. "Used to explore these mountains as a child. My father brought me here when I was 12, taught me how to navigate by counting paces and reading rock formations." She glanced at Cedric. He said knowing the hidden geography of power was more important than knowing the official maps. Smart man. He was. Until he wasn't. They entered the tunnel. Behind them, faint shouts echoed through the fortress. The Crown Guard had arrived and found their quarry missing. Time was running out. The passage was barely wide enough for one person, the ceiling so low Cedric had to hunch. Water dripped from cracks in the rock, and the air smelled like old earth and forgotten things. He'd only used this route twice before, once during a siege 30 years ago, and once to smuggle someone out of the fortress who'd needed to disappear quickly and permanently. He tried not to think about what had happened to that person later. "How far does this go?" Alara asked behind him. "Quarter mile to the cave system. Another 2 miles through the caves to the north exit. 3 hours if we're careful. 2 if we're desperate. And if they find the passage?" Marcus answered from the rear. "Then we'll know because they'll be shooting at us in a very enclosed space." Encouraging. They moved in silence for several minutes. Nothing but footsteps and breathing and the occasional drip of water. The torch threw wild shadows against the walls, making the passage seem to twist and writhe around them. "Why did you really stay?" Cedric asked finally. "You could have left yesterday. Hell, you could have left a week ago when the arrest warrant was issued, but you waited until the last possible moment and then showed up asking questions. Why?" Alara was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "Because I needed to look you in the eye when I asked if you killed my father. Letters and evidence are one thing, but I needed to see your face. And I believe you, just like that? No, not just like that." She slipped on wet stone and caught herself against the wall. "I've been watching you for 5 years, sitting in council meetings, observing how you make decisions. You're a bastard, and you're ruthless, and you've done terrible things, but you're not a liar. You don't pretend to be better than you are. When you order someone's execution, you don't hide behind paperwork or intermediaries. You own it." She paused. "My father would have respected that, even if he disagreed with your methods." "Edmund thought I was redeemable," Cedric said. "He was wrong." "Was he?" "Because from where I'm standing, you just chose to help someone instead of accepting a comfortable death. That seems like character growth to me. That's just guilt with extra steps." "Maybe. Or maybe you're not as empty as you pretend to be." Before he could respond, Marcus hissed a warning from behind. "Quiet. Listen." They froze. In the distance, echoing through the passage behind them, came the sound of boots on stone. Lots of boots. "They found it faster than I expected," Marcus muttered. "Or they already knew about it." Alara's voice was tight, which means someone gave them information about Blackthorn's hidden passages. Cedric felt cold realization settle in his stomach. Only 3 people alive knew about this tunnel. Himself, Marcus, and he didn't finish the thought. Didn't need to. Sometimes betrayal was just another cost of staying alive. And you couldn't really blame people for choosing themselves when every other option led to death. "How much of a head start do we have?" Alara asked. "Maybe 5 minutes." Marcus was already moving faster. Not enough. The passage opened suddenly into a wider chamber where 3 tunnels branched in different directions. Cedric paused, considering options that were all various shades of terrible. "We split up," he said. "Bad idea," Marcus countered. "We stay together. We've got strength in numbers. We stay together, they follow us in force, and we all die." Cedric pointed at the left passage. "That one loops back toward the fortress. Creates the impression we're trying to circle around them." He indicated the center tunnel. "That one's a dead end about 100 yards in. Collapsed during an earthquake 20 years ago. And the right? Leads to the caves. And eventually freedom." Alara understood immediately. "You want to split up and create false trails so they don't know which way we went." "More or less." Cedric looked at Marcus. "You take Alara through the right passage, get her to the north exit, and then to Millbrook. Find Sylvie, like I said. And where will you be?" "Left passage. Making noise. Drawing them toward the fortress, so you've got time to get clear." "That's suicide." "Probably. But it's suicide that serves a purpose, which is the best kind." Marcus grabbed Cedric's shoulder, gripped tight enough to hurt. "I've followed you through 15 years of battles, betrayals, and bad decisions. Don't ask me to abandon you now. I'm not asking." Cedric's voice went flat with command. "I'm ordering. You're the only person I trust to get her out alive. Don't waste that by dying beside me because of some misplaced sense of loyalty." "It's not misplaced. It is if you die for it." He met Marcus's eyes. "You taught me that, remember? After the Westerbrook campaign, when I wanted to go back for the wounded and you physically dragged me onto a horse because sometimes retreating is the only tactical choice that matters. That was different." "No, it wasn't." Cedric could hear the pursuing soldiers getting closer. "I need you to do what I couldn't back then. I need you to survive." For a long moment, Marcus just stared at him. Then he nodded once, jaw tight. "If you die down here, I'm going to be very angry. I'll keep that in mind." Alara stepped forward. "For the record, this is a terrible plan. Most of mine are, but it's the one that gives you the best chance, so we're using it." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a leather journal bound with string. "My father's notes. Everything he found about the corruption in the Crown administration. Names, dates, financial records. Some of it's encrypted, but there's enough clear information to start building a case." She held it out. Cedric stared at it like it was a poisonous snake. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because if something happens to me, the truth dies. But if you survive, you might actually be motivated enough to do something with this information." She pressed it into his hands. "My father believed you were the kind of person who could change things. Prove him right." "Alara, I can't." "You don't get a choice." She was already moving toward the right passage with Marcus. "This is the burden you carry now. Welcome to caring about something besides your own survival. It's terrible. You'll hate it." Then she disappeared into the darkness, Marcus following close behind. Cedric stood alone in the junction chamber, holding Edmund Fenwick's journal and feeling the weight of expectations he'd spent decades trying to avoid. In the distance, the pursuing soldiers were close enough that he could hear individual voices shouting orders. He had maybe 2 minutes. He tucked the journal inside his coat and moved toward the left passage, already planning how to make maximum noise with minimum risk. The trick was surviving long enough to be useful later, which required calculations he'd gotten very good at over the years. Stay loud, stay mobile. Lead them on a chase that bought Marcus and Alara at least 30 minutes of clean escape time. Then find a way out that didn't involve a heroic last stand because those looked better in stories than they worked in practice. The soldiers entered the junction chamber just as Cedric reached the bend in the left passage. He paused, visible for just a moment in the torchlight, then let them see him run. Behind him, he heard the squad leader shout orders to pursue. Most of the force crashed after him into the left passage, exactly as planned. But not all of them. A smaller group split off toward the right passage, following the very obvious trail that 2 people trying to move quietly would leave. Cedric felt his chest tighten. Marcus was good, and Alara was smart, but they were being tracked by professionals who knew exactly what they were looking for. They'd be caught within the hour, unless someone eliminated the trackers first. He stopped running, turned around, and moved back toward the junction chamber with a sword in his hand, and absolutely no plan beyond making sure the people chasing Alara never made it out of these tunnels. This was the thing about having nothing left to lose. It made you very dangerous and very stupid in equal measure. Hard to tell which was more useful. The first soldier came around the corner expecting a fleeing target and found instead a man who'd spent decades turning violence into an art form. Cedric's blade took him in the throat before he could shout a warning. The second soldier managed to draw his weapon but not to use it. The third got a strike off that opened a line of fire across Cedric's shoulder before he died. By the time the rest of the squad realized what was happening, 3 bodies were bleeding out on the stone floor, and Cedric was already moving deeper into the passage, leaving a trail obvious enough to ensure they all followed him instead of splitting up again. Pain radiated from his shoulder, but pain was just information. Information that could be processed later when immediate survival wasn't occupying every available mental resource. The passage narrowed. The ceiling dropped lower. Cedric knew this section, knew it ended in a chamber that had exactly 2 exits, both of which could be defended by a single person if they were willing to make that stand permanent. He also knew there was a third option that nobody else remembered because it hadn't been used in 50 years and probably didn't work anymore, but probably was better than definitely dead. The chamber opened before him, circular and ancient, with walls carved by water over centuries. The 2 visible exits were exactly where he remembered. The third, the one he was betting everything on, was just a crack in the rock face that looked like natural formation unless you knew what to look for. He squeezed through the crack into a space barely wide enough for his shoulders. Behind him, soldiers crashed into the chamber, spreading out to cover both exits, shouting orders and checking for traps. Cedric pushed deeper into the crack. It was getting tighter, the walls pressing against his ribs, making it hard to breathe. His wounded shoulder screamed protest every time he twisted. The torch had gone out somewhere back in the main passage, leaving only absolute darkness and the sound of his own breathing. The crack opened suddenly into a space he couldn't see but could feel was larger. He stepped forward carefully, testing the ground with each foot, and found himself on a ledge overlooking something vast and empty. Behind him, torchlight flickered at the entrance to the crack. Someone had found it. Someone was coming through. Cedric looked down into darkness and made a decision that was probably stupid, but definitely necessary. He jumped. The fall lasted maybe 3 seconds, but felt like 3 years. Then he hit water that was so cold it stopped his heart for a beat. He went under, the current immediately trying to drag him somewhere deeper and darker than anywhere he'd ever been. His coat was heavy. His boots were heavier. The sword at his belt was actively trying to kill him through the simple physics of weight and gravity. He kicked toward what he hoped was up. His lungs burned. The darkness was absolute and disorienting, and he had no idea which direction was surface and which was just more water forever. His hand broke through into air. He gasped, swallowed water, coughed, and managed to get his face above the current long enough to breathe. The water was moving fast, pulling him through what felt like a narrow channel, and all he could do was try not to drown while it carried him somewhere unknown. Above, very faint, he heard shouting. The soldiers had found the ledge, were debating whether anyone could have survived the jump. Cedric let the current take him and hoped they decided the answer was no. The water pulled him through darkness that went on forever, and he stopped trying to fight it, just focused on keeping his head up and breathing whenever the current allowed. His shoulder burned like someone had poured acid into the wound. His entire body was going numb from cold. Time stopped meaning anything. Eventually, could have been minutes or hours, the current changed, slowed, the channel widened, and suddenly there was light. Cedric crashed against something solid, a rock. He grabbed it, held on, pulled himself partially out of the water, and just lay there shaking while his body tried to remember how to function. He was in a large cavern lit by cracks in the ceiling that let in daylight from somewhere far above. The water had carried him miles from Blackthorn, through underground rivers that probably connected to the northern mountain system. He was alive. Against all probability and good sense, he was alive. He pulled himself fully onto the rock and checked for what he'd lost in the fall. Sword, gone. Boots, gone. The journal Ilara had given him, still tucked inside his coat, soaked but intact. He lay there for a long time, breathing and bleeding and wondering what the hell happened now. Eventually, because staying meant dying slowly from cold and blood loss, he forced himself to stand. The cavern had passages leading in several directions. He picked one at random and started walking, one foot in front of the other. Because that's all survival really was. Just keep moving until you run out of reasons or ground to move on. Somewhere above, the world thought Duke Cedric Ravenscar was dead. That was fine. Maybe that person was. Maybe the man walking through these caves barefoot and bleeding was someone different. Someone who'd been given a second chance he absolutely didn't deserve. The question was what to do with it. But 3 days later, a woman opened her door in the small town of Millbrook to find a ghost standing on her porch. Sylvie had been expecting Marcus and possibly the Fennec girl. She had not been expecting Cedric himself, looking like he'd crawled out of his own grave, which, according to the official Crown reports now circulating, he essentially had. The Royal Guard had confirmed Duke Ravenscar died resisting arrest at Blackthorn Keep, killed in a tunnel collapse while attempting to flee justice. His body was never recovered, but that was just dramatic flair at this point. Everyone knew he was dead, except he was currently bleeding on her doorstep with eyes that looked like they'd seen the actual afterlife and decided to come back anyway. "You're supposed to be helping Marcus, not visiting me directly," Sylvie said quietly. She was 70 years old, built like someone who'd survived things that should have killed them, and had known Cedric since he was a child, barely old enough to understand what his family name meant. Marcus and Lady Fennec made it out. He paused. "I checked. They're safe. And you?" Cedric looked down at himself, barefoot, shirtless, wrapped in a stolen blanket over the remains of his ruined clothes. The wound in his shoulder crudely bandaged with strips of fabric that were soaked through with blood. Not safe, but not dead either. Jury's still out on which is worse. Sylvie grabbed his arm and pulled him inside before anyone could see. "Sit. Don't bleed on the good furniture." He collapsed into a chair that had seen better decades while she disappeared into another room and returned with supplies that suggested she'd been preparing for exactly this situation, which she probably had. Sylvie had been House Ravenscar's unofficial fixer for 40 years, which meant she planned for disasters the way other people planned for dinner parties. She cleaned his wound with something that burned worse than the original injury. "You're infected. Probably been walking for days without proper treatment like an idiot." 2 days. And I'm not an idiot, just pragmatic about what qualifies as proper treatment when you're dead and can't visit a doctor. She packed the wound with herbs that smelled like every battlefield he'd ever survived. "This needs stitches. Real ones. But that'll do for now." She wrapped it tightly with clean bandages. "How did you find me?" "I remembered where you lived, and I figured if anyone in this territory would still help me, it would be you." "Why would I help a man who's been declared dead by the Crown and blamed for approximately 36 murders?" Cedric met her eyes. "Because I need to know who set me up. Who had the resources and motivation to build a case strong enough to convince the king, to plant evidence across multiple investigations, to coordinate my arrest and execution with enough precision that it almost worked." He leaned forward despite the pain it cost him. "Someone powerful wanted me gone, Sylvie. Someone who knew enough about my operations to make the accusations believable. And I think it's the same someone who killed Edmund Fennec and is still out there making decisions that affect thousands of lives." Sylvie finished with the bandages. "And what exactly do you plan to do about it?" "I don't know yet. Learn who they are. Find evidence. Maybe survive long enough to ruin their day the way they ruined mine. That's not much of a plan. It's what I've got." She studied him for a long moment. Then she crossed to a locked cabinet and pulled out a small wooden box. "After your arrest, I did some digging. Called in favors from people who owe me more than they owe the Crown." She opened the box and removed several folded documents. "Found something interesting." "Which is?" "The Inquisitor who signed your arrest warrant? Lord Matthias Corrin?" She laid out the first document, a financial ledger filled with numbers and dates. "He's been receiving payments from an unknown source for 7 years. Started right around the time Edmund Fennec disappeared. Significant payments, enough to buy himself a new estate and fund a lifestyle well above his official salary." Cedric leaned closer, scanning the numbers. "These are routed through multiple intermediaries, professional money laundering." "Exactly, which means whoever's paying him knows how to hide their tracks." She laid out the second document. "But here's where it gets interesting. 3 months ago, payments increased dramatically. Doubled, then tripled. Someone was preparing for something big. My arrest. Your execution." Sylvie's voice was hard. "They weren't just removing you from power, Cedric. They were making absolutely certain you died. The arrest was theater. The real plan was killing you in those tunnels and blaming it on collapse or combat. He absorbed this. Any idea who's making the payments? I've got theories, but nothing solid enough to move on." She pulled out the final document, a list of names. "These are people connected to Corrin through business relationships or family ties. Any of them could be the source, or they could all be intermediaries hiding someone even more powerful." Cedric scanned the list. 3 names jumped out immediately: people he'd worked with, people he'd trusted. One name in particular made his blood run cold. She was silent, watching him process. If this is right, he said slowly, then the corruption goes deeper than Edmund Fenwick ever suspected. This isn't just a few lords skimming taxes or falsifying records. This is systemic. Someone's been building a parallel power structure inside the Crown administration for years, and they're willing to kill anyone who gets close to exposing it. And now you're one of the few people who knows enough to be dangerous to them, which means I'm either the perfect person to bring them down, or I'm a dead man walking who just doesn't know it yet. Sylvie poured them both whiskey from a bottle she kept for emergencies. Possibly both. Cedric drank. The alcohol mixed with exhaustion and pain medication in ways that made the room tilt slightly. I need to find Marcus and Alara. They have Edmund's journal with more evidence. If we can combine that with what you've found... They're gone! Sylvie cut him off. Left Millbrook yesterday, headed north. Marcus said something about finding allies in the mountain territories who still remember what House Ravenscar did during the border wars. Smart. Keep moving. Don't establish a pattern. He paused. Did they know I survived? No. As far as they know, you died in that tunnel, giving them time to escape. Marcus took it hard. The girl took it harder, though she tried not to show it. Why would Alara care if I died? Because despite everything, she saw something in you worth saving. Sylvie refilled his glass. Same as her father did. Same as I do, for that matter, though I'm old enough to know better. You're all fools. Probably. But we're fools who are still alive and in a position to help, which counts for something. Cedric stared into his whiskey and saw reflections of everything he'd lost and everything he still had left to lose. The smart move was disappearing completely. Taking a new name, going somewhere remote, living out whatever years remained in quiet anonymity. But Edmund Fenwick had died trying to expose the truth. Alara was out there right now risking everything to finish her father's work. Marcus had betrayed his oath and his position to help them escape. And Cedric was tired of running from debts he'd accumulated by being too pragmatic to care about anything except survival. I need supplies, he said, clothes that don't mark me as nobility, weapons, money, and information on how to move through the northern territories without being recognized. You're not disappearing. No, you're going after them. Going to find whoever set you up and make them pay. Not pay. He met her eyes. I'm going to expose them. Drag everything into daylight. Let the kingdom see exactly how corrupt the system really is. He paused. And if a few people die in the process, well, that's just symmetry. Sylvie smiled, and it was not a comforting expression. Now that sounds like the Cedric Ravenscar I remember. Before you got all civilized and started pretending to play by rules. I never pretended. I just got good at hiding the parts that didn't fit the role. Well, lucky for you, there's no role to play anymore. You're dead, remember? Which means you don't have to maintain appearances or worry about scandal or protect a reputation that no longer exists. She raised her glass. To being dead. It's surprisingly liberating. He clinked his glass against hers. To being dead. And to making the people who killed me very sorry they didn't finish the job. They drank. Outside, night was falling over Millbrook, and somewhere in the northern territories, two people were carrying evidence that could bring down the most powerful corruption network the kingdom had ever seen. And somewhere else, in the capital probably, in some comfortable office where decisions were made over expensive wine and quiet conversation, the person responsible for Edmund Fenwick's death and Cedric's execution believed their plan had worked perfectly. That was the problem with killing someone without recovering the body. Sometimes they came back, and sometimes they came back angry. Malt. 2 weeks later, a merchant caravan traveling through the northern mountain pass was stopped at a crown checkpoint. Standard procedure since the Ravenscar incident: increased security, verification of travel documents, inspection of cargo to ensure no one was smuggling anything illegal. The lead inspector was thorough. He checked papers, questioned drivers, and personally examined the cargo of the largest wagon, which was supposedly carrying wool bound for the eastern markets. What he found instead was a bound man gagged and bleeding inside a crate marked fragile textiles. The man was identified as Lord Cedric Harrow, a minor noble connected to the Crown's tax collection office. Also, according to documents found in his possession, one of the intermediaries handling payments to Inquisitor Corrin. Lord Harrow refused to answer questions, said only that he'd been attacked on the road by bandits and robbed of everything except his life. But the inspector was experienced enough to recognize the work of professionals when he saw it. The precision of the beating, the careful selection of injuries designed to hurt without causing permanent damage. The documents placed specifically where they'd be found during a search. This wasn't random violence. This was a message. And messages meant someone was playing a game with stakes high enough to risk Crown attention. The inspector sent word to the capital and released the caravan to continue on its way. He never noticed the driver of the second wagon, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and the posture of someone who'd spent years in military service. Never noticed the young woman traveling as a merchant's daughter in the fourth wagon. Never noticed the cloaked figure walking alongside the caravan who melted into the trees whenever someone looked too closely. By the time Crown investigators arrived at the checkpoint, the caravan was miles away, and Lord Harrow was talking. Not voluntarily, but talking nonetheless. And what he said lit fires that would burn for months. In Millbrook, Sylvie received a message delivered by a child who'd been paid a silver coin to remember nothing about who gave him the letter. She opened it in the privacy of her kitchen and read 3 lines in handwriting she recognized immediately. First payment delivered, more coming, tell no one I'm alive. She burned the letter and smiled to herself, because the kingdom thought Duke Cedric Ravenscar was dead and buried beneath tons of collapsed rock in a tunnel below his destroyed fortress. But dead men, it turned out, were very hard to stop when they had nothing left to lose except the one thing that might actually matter: the truth. And the man currently walking through the Northern Territories with vengeance in his heart and Edmund Fenwick's journal in his coat had finally found something worth dying for that wasn't about power, or pride, or maintaining control. He'd found a cause that was either going to save him or destroy him completely, possibly both. And in the capital, in an office overlooking the city's central square, someone received news that Lord Harrow had been found and was cooperating with Crown investigators. That someone, whose name was not on any list, whose involvement was protected by layers of intermediaries and careful planning, felt the first cold touch of fear they'd experienced in 7 years. Because if Harrow talked, others would fall. And if others fell, eventually someone would talk who knew too much, who could connect dots that were supposed to remain forever scattered. The plan had been perfect. Frame Ravenscar, execute him, close the investigation into Fenwick's disappearance. Bury the evidence of Crown corruption so deep it would never surface. Except Cedric Ravenscar had survived, and now he was hunting. The someone in the capital stood at the window and watched evening fall over the kingdom they'd worked so hard to control from the shadows. Then they reached for paper and began writing orders that would set in motion everything necessary to finish what should have ended in those tunnels, because some threats needed to be eliminated permanently before they burned down everything you'd built. The problem with coming back from the dead was that you had to stay dead long enough for people to stop looking. Cedric learned this the hard way 3 weeks into his resurrection when a Crown patrol nearly caught him in a tavern outside Greymarch. He'd been careful, kept his head down, paid in copper instead of silver, avoided eye contact with anyone who looked like they might remember faces for a living. But careful wasn't the same as invisible, and invisibility was the only currency that mattered when half the kingdom wanted you buried and the other half wanted you on a pike. He'd made it out through the kitchen window while Marcus created a distraction involving a drunk merchant and an overturned table. They'd regrouped 2 miles north in a barn that smelled like rotting hay and animal fear, both of them breathing hard while Alara kept watch at the door with a knife she'd learned to use far too well in the past few weeks. "That was close," Marcus said between breaths. "Too close." Cedric checked the wound in his shoulder that never quite stopped hurting. The infection Sylvie had warned about had turned into something persistent and mean, the kind of thing that made every movement a negotiation with pain. They're increasing patrols. Someone knows we're still operating in the territory. Someone always knows. Alara didn't turn from the door. The question is whether they know it's you specifically or just that there's organized resistance starting to form. Does it matter? Yes. If they think you're alive, they'll throw everything at finding you. If they just think there's general unrest, they'll respond with standard suppression tactics. She glanced back at him. One of those situations we can work with. The other gets us all killed. Marcus wiped sweat from his face despite the cold. We need to move locations again. Can't stay in the Northern Territories much longer. Too many people recognize the Ravenscar features even when you're pretending to be a common laborer. Cedric knew he was right. 3 weeks of living rough had changed his appearance. Longer hair, thick beard, the kind of weight loss that came from eating when you could instead of when you wanted. But bone structure was harder to disguise. The Ravenscar line had looked a certain way for generations. Sharp jaw, heavy brow, eyes that sat deep in the skull like they were trying to hide from the light. Aristocratic features that marked you as clearly as a brand, even when you were covered in dirt and wearing clothes stolen from a dead man. The smart move was heading east into territories where Ravenscar influence had been minimal, disappearing into cities large enough that one more nameless face wouldn't register on anyone's concern. But smart moves were what he'd been making his entire life, and look where that had gotten him. "We're not leaving," he said. Marcus and Alara both turned to look at him. "We're not leaving," he repeated. Because Harrow's testimony created an opening. Crown investigators are asking questions about payment structures and financial irregularities. That's pressure on the network. Pressure creates mistakes. And mistakes create opportunities. Opportunities to do what? Alara's voice was sharp. "You're one man with a stolen identity and a shoulder that's infected badly enough. I can smell it from here. What exactly do you think you're going to accomplish?" What Edmund was trying to accomplish before they killed him. Cedric pulled the journal from inside his coat. Waterlogged, stained, but still readable. Your father documented names, payments, connections. Harrow's testimony confirms some of it. Sylvie's intelligence fills in more gaps. We've got pieces of a map that shows how the corruption network operates. We just need to finish drawing the picture. And then what? Marcus crossed his arms. You take it to the king? The same king who signed your death warrant based on fabricated evidence? He'll definitely believe the word of a dead man over his own advisors. We don't take it to the king. We make it public. Force it into circulation where it can't be buried or denied. Get enough people asking questions that the crown has to respond. That's insanity. They'll hunt down everyone involved in the leak. They'll make examples that'll terrify the population into silence for a generation. Probably. Cedric met his eyes. But right now they're hunting ghosts and shadows. They know someone's out there, but they don't know who or where or what we're planning. That gives us initiative. The moment we lose initiative, we're dead anyway. So we might as well use it while we have it. Alara was quiet for a long moment. Then, my father tried that approach. Tried going public through a journalist he trusted. It got him killed and buried the evidence for 7 years. Your father was working alone. He was also operating from a position of official power, which meant he had something to lose. Cedric gestured at himself, filthy, wounded, legally deceased. I've got nothing left to lose except a life I've already technically lost. That makes me significantly harder to threaten. It also makes you easier to kill without consequence. True. Which is why we need to move fast before they realize killing me is still on the table. Marcus shook his head slowly. You're talking about declaring open war on the most powerful corruption network in the kingdom. With no army, no resources, and no allies except 2 people who are equally wanted by crown authorities. Cedric smiled, and it was the expression of a man who'd spent his entire life calculating odds and had finally stopped caring about favorable outcomes. You say that like it's a bad thing. The plan came together over the next week in a series of late-night meetings held in locations that changed daily. Abandoned barns, forgotten caves, the ruins of a monastery that had burned during the border wars and never been rebuilt. Alara had contacts throughout the northern territories, merchants who'd worked with her father, minor nobles who'd respected House Fennec's integrity, journalists who still believed in truth more than survival. She reached out carefully, never revealing too much, always leaving herself an exit route if the contact proved compromised. Marcus handled security and logistics. He'd spent 15 years learning how to move supplies and people through hostile territory without leaving trails. Those skills translated disturbingly well to operating as a fugitive organization. And Cedric did what he'd always done best. He planned. Not the grand strategy he'd employed as Duke. That required resources and authority he no longer possessed. Instead, he planned like an insurgent. Identify targets. Create chaos. Force the enemy to respond. Exploit the gaps those responses created. The first target was obvious. Lord Matthias Corin, the inquisitor who'd signed Cedric's arrest warrant and had been receiving payments from the corruption network for 7 years. He was compromised, connected, and most importantly, increasingly nervous after Harrow's capture. Nervous people made mistakes. He's increased his personal guard, Alar reported during a meeting in a cave system north of Millbrook. 6 men instead of 4. All professional soldiers, not ceremonial decoration. Someone's warned him he might be a target. Good. That means he's scared. Cedric studied the map they'd assembled showing Corin's movements over the past 2 weeks. Scared people follow patterns. They retreat to places they feel safe. Where does he feel safest? His estate outside the capital. Marcus pointed at a location on the map. Walled compound, controlled access, defensive positions built into the architecture. He's been spending more time there and less time at the Inquisitor's office in the city. How often does he travel between the two? 3 times a week. Same route, same time of day. Marcus traced the road with his finger, leaves the estate at dawn, arrives at the office by mid-morning, returns at sunset. Crown Guard escort of 8 soldiers plus his personal guard. 20 men total? 20 trained fighters protecting 1 corrupt bureaucrat, yes. Alara looked between them. Please tell me you're not considering an ambush on a Crown official's travel route. That's not pressure. That's suicide with extra steps. We're not ambushing him. Cedric leaned back against the cave wall, mind working through angles and possibilities. We're giving him a reason to make a mistake. Something that'll force him to act outside his routine, outside his protection. What kind of reason? The kind that makes him choose between his safety and his secrets. But the message reached Corin 3 days later through channels that ensured it couldn't be traced, but were official enough to seem credible. It claimed to be from an anonymous member of the corruption network, warning him that Crown investigators had obtained financial records linking him directly to multiple illegal payments. The message included specific account numbers, dates, transaction amounts that were accurate enough to be terrifying. It also suggested that if Corin wanted to protect himself, he needed to retrieve certain documents from a dead drop location before investigators found them. The location was isolated, difficult to reach, and definitely outside his normal security protocols. Alara had been skeptical. He'll never fall for this. It's too obvious. But Marcus understood. Men like Corin are used to being the ones pulling strings. When someone pulls their strings, they panic. Panic makes smart people stupid. He was right. 2 days after receiving the message, Corin altered his routine. Left his estate alone except for 2 personal guards. Traveled to a location 15 miles outside the city where he believed documents were hidden that could destroy him. What he found instead was Cedric Ravenscar waiting in a warehouse that had been abandoned so long ago, even the rats had given up on it. The guards died quickly. Not because Cedric enjoyed killing, though he'd stopped pretending it bothered him years ago, but because witnesses complicated everything and complications got people caught. Corin backed against the wall with blood splattered across his expensive coat and his eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from realizing you'd been outsmarted by someone you'd declared dead. You, he whispered. Me. Cedric stepped over the bodies like they were furniture. Surprising, right? You signed my death warrant, attended the announcement of my execution, probably celebrated with expensive wine and congratulations from whoever's paying you. And yet here I am, not remotely dead. This is impossible. You died in the tunnels. The collapse was very convenient for whoever wanted me eliminated without a messy trial. Cedric pulled a knife. Not threatening yet, just present. But I'm curious about something, Matthias. You've been taking payments for 7 years. That's a long time to be compromised. Long enough that you must have participated in more than just my arrest. Corin's hands were shaking. I don't know what you're talking about. No? Cedric moved closer. Let's review. Edmund Fennick discovered evidence of Crown corruption. He tried going public. He disappeared. You were the Inquisitor who declared the investigation into his disappearance closed due to insufficient evidence. That's interesting timing. That was legitimate. 7 people who had information about Fennick's investigation died within 6 months. Accidents, mostly. A few illnesses. You signed off on all the death certificates as requiring no further inquiry. He held up the knife so Corin could see his own reflection in the blade. That's quite a pattern for someone claiming innocence. You can't prove any of this. I don't need to prove it in court. I just need to prove it to the people who matter. Cedric's voice went soft and cold. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me who's been paying you. You're going to give me names, locations, documentation of every transaction you've been involved with. Everything you know about the corruption network structure and operations. And if I refuse, then I kill you right now and work backward from your financial records. It'll take longer, but I'll get there eventually. Your choice is whether you die quickly or whether you spend the next few hours begging me to kill you. Either way, I get what I need." Corin looked at the bodies of his guards, looked at Cedric's eyes and saw something that had stopped pretending to be civilized a long time ago. He started talking. Check. Marcus and Alara were waiting at the rendezvous point when Cedric arrived 3 hours later. He was alone, covered in more blood than could be explained by just 2 dead guards, and carrying a leather satchel that hadn't been with him when he'd left. "Did he talk?" Marcus asked. "Eventually." Cedric dropped the satchel on the ground between them. "Everything's in there. Names, payment schedules, communication protocols. Corin kept better records than I expected. Probably thought he'd need leverage someday if things went bad." "Where is he now?" "Dead. Had an accident during questioning. Tragic." Alara stared at him. "You said you were going to make him cooperate and let him live." "I lied." Cedric met her eyes without flinching. He was a threat. Leaving him alive meant he could warn the network we're coming. So I eliminated the threat. That's how survival works when you're operating outside legal structures. That's not survival, that's murder. It's both. Welcome to the uncomfortable reality of insurgency. You can't fight powerful people using their rules because the rules are designed to protect them. You have to break the rules so thoroughly they can't predict your next move. He gestured at the satchel. "But you're welcome to take the moral high ground and walk away. I won't stop you." She didn't move, just stood there processing the gap between the man who'd claimed he wanted to expose the truth and the man who'd just killed someone in cold blood to protect operational security. Marcus opened the satchel and started going through documents. Bloody hell. This is everything. Financial transfers, coded communications, operational procedures. If even half of this is accurate, the corruption goes higher than we suspected. How high? Royal advisors, treasury officials, military command structure. He looked up. Corin wasn't just taking bribes. He was part of a coordinated effort to infiltrate every level of Crown administration. This has been running for at least a decade. Alara finally found her voice. My father discovered this 10 years ago. That's when he started investigating. That's why they killed him, probably. Cedric's shoulder throbbed. Every breath felt like someone was driving nails through infected tissue. But knowing why doesn't change the present situation. What matters is what we do with this information. We expose it. Marcus was already sorting documents into categories. Get this to journalists, rival nobles, anyone with the platform and motivation to make noise the Crown can't ignore. Won't work. Alara shook her head. My father tried that. They'll just discredit the sources, claim the documents are forged, arrest anyone involved in spreading them. Truth doesn't matter if the people controlling the narrative have enough power to bury it. Then what do you suggest? She looked at Cedric. We don't go after the network directly. We go after their foundation. Make them defend so many positions simultaneously they can't protect everything. Force them into a war of attrition they can't win because we're willing to lose everything, and they're not. Cedric felt something shift in his chest. Recognition of a mind that understood violence not as a tool, but as a language. That's dangerous thinking. Good. She stepped closer. Because safe thinking is what got my father killed, and you framed for crimes you didn't commit. If we're doing this, we do it all the way. No half measures. No mercy for people who've been killing and stealing and destroying lives for a decade. You understand what you're proposing? This isn't exposure. This is war. Yes. Her green eyes were hard as stone. A war they started. We're just finishing it. Marcus looked between them. So we're really doing this. Declaring war on the Crown's inner circle with no army, no resources, and a wanted list that includes all of us. Cedric felt the weight of Edmund Fenwick's journal in his coat. Felt the pain in his shoulder that wouldn't heal. Felt the exhaustion of 3 weeks living like an animal. And underneath all of that, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Something dangerous and stupid and absolutely necessary. Purpose. Not the empty purpose of maintaining power or building dynasties or protecting territory. Real purpose. The kind that came from deciding some things were worth burning your entire life down for, because the alternative was living in a world you couldn't respect. Yes, he said. We're really doing this.
Yes.
The campaign started small. A fire at a warehouse storing falsified tax records. an ambush on a paymaster carrying bribes to regional officials, documents anonymously delivered to journalists who'd been threatened into silence so long they'd forgotten what courage looked like. Each action was calculated to create pressure without revealing their position, force the corruption network to respond, expose their communication channels, identify who was connected to what. But small actions only worked for so long before you needed escalation. The opportunity came in the form of Lord Victor Thane. He was Crown Treasurer. He was Crown, responsible for managing the kingdom's finances and approving all major expenditures. According to Corrin's documents, he'd been orchestrating the corruption network's financial operations for 8 years. Every illegal payment, every falsified ledger, every missing tax dollar passed through systems he controlled. He was also, conveniently, scheduled to attend a Crown Council meeting in Greymarch in 2 weeks. Greymarch was 3 days north of the capital, small enough that security would be lighter than in the city, large enough that chaos would spread quickly if someone created the right kind of disruption. "We can't kill him," Elara insisted during planning. "That crosses a line that brings the full weight of Crown military down on us. We're not killing him." Cedric studied maps of Greymarch's layout. "We're abducting him, taking him somewhere we control, making him testify on record about the corruption network's operations. That's insane." Marcus was sharpening a knife with methodical precision. "He'll be protected by Crown Guard, traveling in a secure convoy, staying in fortified accommodations. You can't just grab a Lord Treasurer like he's some merchant getting robbed. Not alone, no. But with the right distractions and enough chaos to fragment security response?" Cedric traced potential routes on the map. "It becomes possible. Possible and advisable are different things." "Agreed. But we're past the point where advisable matters. We need something dramatic enough to prove we're a legitimate threat. Something that forces the corruption network to either acknowledge we exist or look weak for not responding." Elara leaned over the map. "The council meeting is at the governor's estate. High walls, multiple guard posts, restricted access. But Thane arrives the night before to review financial proposals. That's when he's most vulnerable." She pointed at a road leading into Greymarch. "If we hit the convoy here where the forest provides cover and escape routes, the guard response time is 8 minutes minimum from the nearest garrison." Marcus finished her thought. "We'd have maybe 10 minutes total to isolate Thane, neutralize his protection, and extract him before reinforcements arrive." 10 minutes is tight. Everything's tight when you're declaring war on your own government. They planned for 3 days, scouted locations, acquired supplies through networks that were probably reporting their movements to Crown intelligence but couldn't be avoided, prepared contingencies for a dozen different failure modes. The night before the operation, Cedric found Elara sitting alone outside the cave they were using as a base. She was cleaning a pistol with the kind of focus that suggested she was really trying not to think about what tomorrow meant. He sat beside her without asking permission. "Having second thoughts?" "No." Her hands never stopped moving. "Just wondering when I turned into the kind of person who plans kidnappings and thinks about optimal kill zones. Probably around the same time you decided truth mattered more than staying safe." She was quiet for a moment. "My father wouldn't have approved of this. He believed in working within systems, legal channels, proper procedures. Your father was killed by people who controlled those systems and channels and procedures." Cedric stared at the darkness beyond their small fire. Sometimes the only way to fight corruption is refusing to play by rules that were designed to protect it. That's a dangerous philosophy. Yes, but so is believing justice will somehow manifest if you just follow protocol hard enough. He paused. "I spent 20 years as Duke thinking I was building something lasting, thinking power and control and careful management would create stability. All I really did was maintain a system that was rotting from the inside, and now you're burning it down. Now I'm trying to cut out the rot before it spreads further. Whether that's burning or surgery depends on your perspective." Elara finally looked at him. "You know there's no going back after tomorrow, no returning to normal life, no redemption arc where you get pardoned and restored to nobility. We'll be fugitives forever or we'll be dead." "I know. And you're okay with that?" Cedric thought about Blackthorn Keep burning, about the nobles who'd abandoned him the moment conviction became inconvenient, about Edmund Fenwick disappearing into whatever grave the corrupt had dug for him. "I spent 38 years trying to matter by accumulating power," he said quietly. "Turns out power just makes you a bigger target. Maybe mattering looks like something else." like making sure the next person who tries to expose corruption doesn't die alone and forgotten. She smiled sadly. That's almost noble. Don't mistake pragmatism for virtue. I'm doing this because I'm already dead and have nothing better to do with my remaining time. If I still had Blackthorn and a title, I'd probably be making the same calculated compromises that turned me into someone worth framing for murder. Maybe. Or maybe losing everything showed you what actually matters. Before he could respond, Marcus emerged from the cave. We've got a problem. One of our contacts in Greymarch sent warning. Crown Intelligence knows something's being planned. They're increasing security on all Crown officials traveling to the council meeting. Cedric stood. How much increased? Double the normal guard complement, random route changes, decoy convoys. Damn, Elara was already moving toward the cave. That makes the operation exponentially harder. Harder or impossible? Marcus considered. Harder. Still within the range of achievable if we're willing to accept higher casualties and lower success probability. Define lower. 20% chance we extract Thane successfully. 50% chance we all die trying. 30% chance we accomplish nothing and expose our position to Crown forces that'll hunt us down within 48 hours. Those are terrible odds. Yes, but they're the odds we have. Cedric looked at both of them. Marcus, who'd given up everything to follow a man who couldn't offer him anything except shared fugitive status. Elara, who'd turned herself into exactly the kind of person her father had spent his life opposing just to finish his work. They were here because he'd convinced them this was worth attempting, worth dying for, worth becoming people they'd never imagined becoming, and maybe that made him exactly the kind of monster everyone had always said he was. Or maybe it just made him someone who'd finally found a cause bigger than survival. We proceed as planned, he said. Increased security means they're scared. Scared people make mistakes. We exploit those mistakes. And if there are no mistakes to exploit, then we create them. Passé. The convoy left Greymarch's northern garrison at sunset, moving south toward the governor's estate with the kind of disciplined precision that marked professional military operations. 24 soldiers in formation, 4 carriages, any of which might contain Lord Thane. Advanced scouts checking for ambush points. Cedric watched from a ridge overlooking the road through a spyglass Marcus had acquired from a dead merchant. The increased security was immediately obvious. Too many soldiers. Too much spacing between vehicles. Too careful. They know we're coming, Marcus said beside him. Not specifically us, but they're expecting action. Good. That means they're predictable. Soldiers following defensive protocols are easier to manipulate than soldiers operating on instinct. He collapsed the spyglass. Elara's in position? She signaled ready 10 minutes ago. The tension in Marcus's voice suggested he wasn't happy about using Elara as bait, but operational necessity didn't care about personal comfort. The plan was simple in concept, horrifically dangerous in execution. Elara would create a distraction that forced the convoy to stop and investigate. During that investigation, Cedric and Marcus would hit the most likely carriage containing Thane. The goal was extraction within 3 minutes, escape before reinforcements arrived. The reality was likely to be chaos measured in seconds rather than minutes, with success dependent on factors they couldn't control and luck they probably didn't deserve. Cedric checked his weapons one final time. Sword, 2 knives. Pistol with 6 shots he'd probably miss with because he'd always been better with blades than firearms. He looked at Marcus. If this goes wrong, it's going wrong. The question is how wrong and whether we survive anyway. Fair point. They moved down from the ridge into positions flanking the road. The convoy was close enough now that Cedric could hear horses and the low conversation of soldiers who thought they were safe because they outnumbered any reasonable threat. Then the first explosion shattered the evening. It came from 100 yards south, not close enough to harm the convoy, but close enough to demand immediate response. A fireball climbing into the darkening sky, followed by screams that were probably theatrical but sounded genuine enough. The convoy halted. Officers shouted orders. Soldiers moved toward the explosion in defensive formation, leaving only 8 men to guard the carriages. The second explosion followed 30 seconds later, this one to the north. Now the officers were confused, splitting forces to respond to threats from multiple directions. That was the opening. Cedric burst from the tree line running low and fast. Marcus came from the opposite side. They converged on the second carriage, the one whose security positioning suggested it carried actual cargo rather than decoy weight. The remaining guards reacted with professional speed, but professional speed wasn't quite enough when you were outnumbered by chaos and violence. Cedric's sword took the first guard across the throat. Marcus shot the second before he could raise his weapon. The third managed to draw steel and actually parry Cedric's initial strike before Marcus put a blade through his kidney. 4 guards down in 15 seconds. The remaining 4 were regrouping, shouting for reinforcements that were scattered across 2 false threat locations. Cedric yanked open the carriage door. Inside, Lord Victor Thane pressed himself against the far wall with the expression of a man whose world had just tilted sideways into nightmare territory. He was 50-something, soft from decades of bureaucratic life, wearing clothes expensive enough to fund a small army. "You," he whispered. Surprised, Cedric grabbed him by the expensive collar and hauled him out of the carriage. "You really shouldn't be. When you spend years killing people who know inconvenient truths, eventually one of those inconvenient people comes back. You're dead." The Crown confirmed what they needed to confirm. Cedric shoved Thane toward Marcus. "Now move before I decide killing you is simpler than taking you prisoner." They ran toward the tree line while behind them the convoy descended into controlled chaos. Officers trying to recall scattered soldiers. Guards trying to locate their missing Lord Treasurer. Everything complicated by smoke and confusion and the fundamental chaos that came from plans falling apart. They made it 20 yards before the first shots rang out. Marcus grunted and stumbled. Not hit badly enough to fall, but hit enough that blood immediately started soaking through his coat. "Keep moving," Cedric ordered, half-dragging Thane while trying to cover Marcus's wounded side. They crashed into the forest. Behind them, soldiers were organizing pursuit. Ahead, the escape route they'd mapped led through 2 miles of rough terrain to where horses waited with Alara. 2 miles. With a wounded man, a prisoner, and probably 30 soldiers hunting them. The odds had just gotten significantly worse. They ran. Alara was waiting at the rendezvous point with 3 horses and an expression that turned grim the moment she saw blood. "How bad?" Marcus pressed a hand against his side where the bullet had punched through. "Flesh wound. I'll live if we stop the bleeding. We don't have time to stop the bleeding." Cedric shoved Thane toward one of the horses. "Get him mounted and tied. I'll handle Marcus." The sounds of pursuit were getting closer. Soldiers crashing through underbrush, officers shouting coordinates, dogs that shouldn't have been available this quickly, but apparently were. Alara worked fast, binding Thane's hands and securing him to the saddle, while Cedric wrapped Marcus's wound tight enough to slow the bleeding. It wasn't medical care. It was temporary damage control that would keep him functional for another hour if they were lucky. "Can you ride?" Cedric asked. Marcus pulled himself onto his horse through pure stubbornness. "Can I ride well enough to outrun Crown Guard?" "Let's find out." They rode hard into darkness, following paths Alara had scouted that avoided main roads and settlements. Thane bounced in his saddle like cargo, occasionally making sounds of protest that everyone ignored. The pursuit stayed close for the first hour, then gradually fell back as distance and darkness made tracking harder. By midnight, they'd put enough miles between themselves and Greymarch that immediate capture felt less likely. They stopped at a stream to rest the horses and check Marcus's wound. It was worse than he'd admitted. The bullet had gone through but had torn tissue on the way. He was losing blood steadily despite the bandaging, and his face had gone the color of old paper. "You need a doctor," Alara said. "I need to not get captured. Doctors can wait. You'll die if you don't get treatment. Then I'll die." Marcus drank from the stream with shaking hands. But not today. Cedric checked Thane, who was slumped against a tree with the expression of someone trying to process exactly how his life had become an action he was no longer directing. "You're going to talk," Cedric said without preamble. "You're going to tell us everything about the corruption network, how it's structured, who's involved, where the records are kept, everything." Thane lifted his head. "You're insane. The Crown will hunt you to the edges of the earth. You can't possibly think you'll survive this." "I don't think I'll survive this. That's what makes me dangerous. People with nothing to lose make terrible enemies because you can't threaten them with consequences they've already accepted." He pulled out Edmund Fenwick's journal. This belonged to a man you helped murder, a man who was trying to expose exactly the kind of corruption you've been orchestrating for years. "I'm going to finish his work. You can help by cooperating, or I can extract information through methods that'll make you wish you'd cooperated. Your choice. Thane's eyes went to Marcus's wound, to Alara's hard expression, to Cedric's face, which had stopped pretending civilization mattered somewhere around the third week of being legally dead. If I talk, they'll kill me. They'll kill you anyway. Cedric leaned closer. But if you talk, you die quickly, and maybe, some part of your testimony helps bring down the people who used you. If you don't talk, you die slowly and accomplish nothing except confirming you were exactly the coward everyone suspected. Silence stretched between them like wire pulled too tight. Then Thane started talking. He talked for 3 hours while Alara took notes and Marcus tried not to pass out from blood loss. He detailed financial structures, payment channels, coded communication systems, named names at every level of Crown administration. Explained how the corruption network had infiltrated not just government but military command, judiciary positions, regional governorships. It was systematic, organized, far more extensive than even Corrin's documents had suggested, and at the center of it all, pulling strings and making decisions that affected the entire kingdom, was a name that made Cedric's blood run cold when he heard it. Chancellor Helena Voss, the king's most trusted advisor, the woman who'd served the crown for 20 years, who'd been present at Cedric's arrest, who'd probably orchestrated the entire frame-up that had destroyed House Ravenscar and nearly killed him in the process.
She's been running this the entire time, Thane said quietly, since before any of us were involved. She recruited me 15 years ago.
Said she was building a system that would stabilize the kingdom by ensuring proper people maintained proper control. He laughed bitterly. I believed her. Thought I was serving a greater good. Took me 10 years to realize I was just enabling theft and murder on a scale that would make warlords jealous.
And Edmund Fenwick? Alara's voice was very quiet. Did you know about his death?
Thane nodded. Voss ordered it. Said he was too close to evidence that would unravel years of careful work. Made it look like natural causes first. A writing accident that didn't take. Then just had him disappeared. I didn't participate directly, but I knew. Everyone at my level knew. We just pretended not to because acknowledging it meant accepting we were complicit in murder. The weight of that admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Alara turned away, shoulders shaking with something that might have been grief or rage or the horrible combination of both. Cedric felt the exhaustion of 3 weeks catching up all at once. They'd confirmed the corruption went to the highest levels of government. They'd identified the person responsible. They'd gathered testimony that could potentially bring down the entire network. And they were 3 fugitives with 1 wounded man, no resources, and a prisoner who was a liability they couldn't afford to keep but couldn't afford to release. What now? Marcus asked through gritted teeth. Cedric looked at the sky where dawn was beginning to stain the horizon. Now we figure out how to expose a chancellor who controls crown intelligence, military command, and probably the king's own decision-making process. We do it with no allies, no support, and the entire kingdom hunting us. That's impossible, probably. He stood despite every muscle screaming protest, but so was surviving that tunnel collapse, so was escaping Blackthorn with Crown Guard executing everyone who stayed loyal, so was abducting a Lord Treasurer from a secured convoy. We've been doing impossible things for weeks now. What's one more? Alara turned back to face them. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. We find someone with enough power to challenge Voss directly, someone she hasn't corrupted or can't control. Someone who can take this testimony and evidence to the king in a way that can't be buried or dismissed. And who exactly has that kind of power? Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching horses cut through the dawn. Not close yet, but close enough that running would be the only option in about 5 minutes. Marcus tried to stand and nearly collapsed. I can't ride much further. Blood loss is... I know. Cedric grabbed his arm, steadying him. Alara, get Thane on his horse. We need to move now. She was already moving, hauling Thane to his feet and toward the animals. They mounted up, Marcus swaying dangerously in his saddle. The pursuit was audible now. Maybe a dozen riders moving fast through terrain they knew better than 3 fugitives and a prisoner. Cedric led them north toward mountains that might provide cover or might just be where they finally ran out of options. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. And somewhere in the capital, Chancellor Helena Voss received a report that Lord Victor Thane had been abducted. The testimony was being extracted, and that the dead duke, who'd been such a useful scapegoat, had inconveniently survived his execution. She stood at her office window watching morning light spread across the kingdom. She'd spent 2 decades manipulating into exactly the shape she wanted. Then she reached for paper and began writing orders that would mobilize every resource at her disposal. Because some threats couldn't be allowed to survive. Even if they were already supposed to be dead. The safe house was a shepherd's hut built into the side of a mountain where civilized people stopped visiting 3 generations ago. No roads, no neighbors. Just stone and timber that had survived enough winters to suggest permanence, even though everything eventually fell apart if you gave it enough time. Marcus made it another 6 hours before the blood loss caught up with him. He collapsed while trying to help secure Thane to a support beam, just went down like someone had cut his strings. Alara caught him before his head cracked against the floor, lowering him with a gentleness that contradicted everything she'd become over the past month. Cedric checked the wound and felt cold reality settle in his chest. The bullet had done more internal damage than any of them had wanted to acknowledge. Marcus was dying. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon enough that planning around his continued existence was optimistic at best. "You need a surgeon," Cedric said quietly. Marcus opened his eyes, pale blue and harder than ice despite the fact they were currently occupying a face the color of old meat. "What I need is for you to stop stating obvious problems and start solving them. There's no solving this one. Not out here, not without medical care we can't access without exposing our position. Then I guess we see how long stubbornness works as a substitute for proper treatment." He coughed, and blood flecked his lips. "Been a good run anyway, longer than most soldiers get." Alara pressed cloth against the wound even though they both knew it was pointless. "We didn't come this far just to watch you die in some forgotten hut in the middle of nowhere. No, we came this far to expose corruption and probably die trying. The location is just details." Cedric moved to the small window that looked out over valleys stretching toward territories he'd once controlled and would never control again. Behind him, Thane sat bound and silent, watching the drama unfold with the expression of someone calculating whether his captor's dysfunction created opportunities for escape. The truth was, they'd accomplished more than anyone had right to expect. They'd survived the execution. They'd gathered evidence. They'd abducted and extracted testimony from a Lord Treasurer. They'd confirmed that Chancellor Helena Voss was running a corruption network that had infiltrated every major institution in the kingdom. And none of it mattered if they couldn't get that information to someone with enough power to act on it. "We need to make contact with someone in the capital," Alara said, still working on Marcus despite the futility. "Someone outside Voss's control who can present this evidence to the king directly. Everyone of significance is either corrupted or terrified." Cedric turned from the window. "Your father tried finding allies in the capital. It got him killed. My father was operating alone and didn't have concrete evidence. We have testimony from a Lord Treasurer, financial records, communication protocols. That's harder to dismiss than one man's accusations. It's also harder to deliver when every route into the capital is monitored by people who want us dead." Thane spoke for the first time in hours, his voice rough. "There's one person Voss can't control. One person the king actually listens to above all his advisors. They all turned to look at him." "Who?" Cedric asked. "Princess Mira, the king's daughter. She's been pushing for financial reforms that threaten the corruption network's operations. Voss has been maneuvering to marginalize her influence, but the king still grants her private audiences. If you could get your evidence to her, we'd be dead before we got within 100 yards of the palace." Cedric crossed his arms. "Royal security isn't something you penetrate with determination and clever planning. It's designed by professionals to stop exactly this kind of approach. Then you don't approach the palace." Thane shifted against his restraints. "The princess visits a private estate outside the capital every month. Smaller security detail. More vulnerable to contact if you're willing to take the risk." "And why exactly are you helping us?" Alara's voice was sharp with suspicion. "You're part of the system we're trying to destroy. Why give us information that could actually succeed?" Thane met her eyes. "Because I've spent 15 years watching that system destroy good people and elevate monsters. Because I'm going to die regardless of what happens next. Either you'll kill me, or Voss will arrange an accident to ensure my silence. At least this way my death accomplishes something besides confirming I was exactly the coward I've always been." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had burned down everything worth saving. "When does the princess visit this estate?" Marcus asked from the floor, where he was still bleeding despite all efforts to stop it. 3 days from now." Thane's voice was steady. The estate is called Silverwood, 2 hours northwest of the capital. She goes there to paint, apparently.
One of those aristocratic hobbies that looks eccentric, but is really just a way to escape the pressure of court politics. How do you know this?
Because I approved the security budget for her private excursions. Voss tried to cut funding to force the princess to stay in the capital where she's easier to control. I restored it because even corrupt bureaucrats occasionally do one decent thing to help them sleep at night. Cedric considered angles. 3 days wasn't much time to plan an approach to someone under royal protection, but it was more time than they'd had for most operations over the past month, and desperation made you work with whatever opportunities appeared. "If we're doing this, we need to move soon," he said. "Marcus can't travel much further, and the longer we stay in one location, the higher the chance Crown Intelligence triangulates our position. I can travel." Marcus tried to sit up and immediately abandoned the attempt. "Just need a few hours rest. You need surgery and weeks of recovery, neither of which we can provide." Cedric's voice was flat with the kind of honesty that hurt more than lying. "You're staying here while Alara and I make contact with the princess. Like hell. I didn't follow you through 15 years of bad decisions just to miss the finale because of one inconvenient bullet wound. It's not a request." Cedric moved closer, lowering his voice. "You taught me tactical thinking. You know the mathematics. One wounded man slows down the entire operation and decreases success probability. I need you to stay here, guard Thane, and wait to die while you two finish the mission." Marcus's laugh was bitter. "Very generous of you." "I'm not being generous. I'm being practical. Someone needs to ensure Thane's testimony survives, even if Alara and I don't make it back. That's you." He held Marcus's gaze. "This is the last order I'll ever give you as your commander. Don't waste it by dying pointlessly." For a long moment, Marcus just stared at him. Then he nodded once, jaw tight with resignation. "Fine. But if you die stupidly, I'm going to be very disappointed." Noted. Alara was already gathering supplies. "We leave at first light. That gives us 2 days to reach Silverwood and plan an approach before the princess arrives." Cedric returned to the window and stared out at mountains that had watched kingdoms rise and fall long before Ravenscar existed, and would keep watching long after his name was forgotten. Somewhere in those valleys, Crown Guard was searching. Somewhere in the capital, Helena Voss was coordinating response to their actions. Somewhere, the machinery of a corrupt government was grinding toward their elimination with the inevitability of winter. And he was about to walk into the center of it all with nothing but stolen evidence and a desperate hope that one princess might care more about truth than political survival. The odds were terrible, but terrible odds were all they'd ever had. They reached Silverwood on the evening of the second day, exhausted and half-starved from traveling through terrain that made speed and concealment equally impossible. The estate sat in a valley surrounded by forest, elegant architecture that suggested wealth without the aggressive fortification of military installations. Security was visible, but not overwhelming. Maybe 20 guards patrolling the perimeter, discreet observation posts at key points. Professional, but not paranoid. Still more than 2 people could overcome through direct confrontation. "We need an approach that doesn't involve fighting through trained soldiers," Alara said from their position in the trees overlooking the estate. "Something that gets us close to the princess without triggering full security response." Cedric studied the layout through the spyglass. "The princess is here to paint. That means she'll spend time outdoors, probably somewhere scenic with good light. Guards will maintain distance to give her privacy because you can't be creative with soldiers breathing down your neck. So we approach her during one of these outdoor sessions. We approach her when she's alone enough that we can talk before security reacts. Deliver the evidence, make our case, and exit before the situation escalates into something that gets everyone killed. That's not much of a plan. It's the plan that doesn't require us to assault a guarded estate with resources we don't have." He lowered the spyglass. "Besides, if we can't convince one princess that corruption matters more than political convenience, we were never going to succeed anyway." They waited through the night, taking turns on watch while the other rested. By morning, activity at the estate increased. Carriages arrived. Servants moved with the purposeful efficiency that suggested important guests. Then the princess emerged. Princess Mira was younger than Cedric expected. Maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back severely, and the kind of posture that came from growing up under constant observation. She wore simple clothes instead of court finery, carrying an easel and painting supplies, like someone who actually used them instead of just posing with them for portraits. 2 guards followed at a distance as she walked toward a clearing near a stream where morning light hit the water in ways artists probably cared about. She set up her equipment, dismissed the guards to a position 30 yards away, and began working. This was the opportunity. Cedric and Alara moved through the forest with the kind of silence that came from weeks of avoiding detection by people hunting them professionally. They reached a position behind the princess where approaching wouldn't immediately trigger guard response. Then Cedric stepped into the clearing and spoke quietly. "Your Highness, I apologize for the intrusion, but I need approximately 3 minutes of your time before your security kills me." Princess Mira turned, brush still in hand, and her expression shifted from surprise to calculation so fast it was almost impressive. Her eyes went to the guards, judging distance and response time, then back to Cedric, taking in his appearance. Rough clothes, obvious exhaustion, the kind of intensity that marked people operating beyond normal survival parameters. "You're not an assassin," she said calmly. "Assassins don't announce themselves and request meetings. No, I'm something more dangerous. I'm someone who knows the truth about Chancellor Voss's corruption network and can prove it." He kept his hands visible, non-threatening. "The name is Cedric Ravenscar. I'm supposed to be dead. But before I finish dying properly, I need you to hear what your father's most trusted advisor has been doing to this kingdom for 20 years. She studied him for a long moment. Then she called out to the guards without breaking eye contact. "Stay where you are. I'll handle this." The guards looked uncertain but obeyed, hands on weapons. "You have 3 minutes," she said to Cedric. "Use them well." He did. He told her everything. About Edmund Fenwick's investigation and death. About the evidence Corin had kept. About Thane's testimony detailing the scope of corruption infiltrating Crown administration. About how Voss had orchestrated his frame-up and execution to protect a network that had been stealing from the kingdom for decades. When he finished, Princess Mira was silent for several heartbeats. Then she set down her brush with the kind of precision that suggested she was using the gesture to process information that violated everything she thought she knew about power structures around her father. "You're asking me to believe the Chancellor, a woman who's served the crown loyally since before I was born, is running a criminal enterprise from inside the government. I'm not asking you to believe anything." Alara emerged from the trees carrying the leather satchel containing all their evidence. "I'm asking you to look at documentation and testimony from sources you can verify independently. Then make your own determination about whether the corruption is real or just the desperate accusation of fugitives trying to avoid execution." She handed over the satchel. Princess Mira opened it, pulling out documents that Alara had organized into categories. Financial records, communication protocols, Thane's written testimony. Everything that proved Voss had built an empire of corruption while pretending to serve the kingdom. The princess read in silence, her expression growing darker with each page. The guards were getting nervous, sensing something significant was happening but uncertain whether to intervene. Finally, she looked up. "If I present this to my father, Voss will know immediately. She'll either destroy the evidence, kill everyone involved, or convince the king that it's all fabricated by enemies of the crown. She'll survive because that's what powerful people do when threatened. They eliminate the threat and reinforce their position." "Probably," Cedric agreed, "but you'll have planted doubt, created pressure, forced her to expend resources defending herself instead of expanding her network. That's more than anyone's accomplished in 20 years. And what happens to you? We disappear if we can, die if we can't. Either way, the evidence survives and maybe starts dismantling a system that's been destroying lives since before you were old enough to understand what corruption meant." Princess Mira studied him with eyes that saw too much. "You were Duke of the Northern Territories. My father spoke of you as someone who understood power and used it effectively. What happened to turn you into a fugitive delivering conspiracy documents in the woods?" "I died. And the person who came back decided power mattered less than truth." Cedric felt the exhaustion of 5 weeks catching up all at once. "Your Highness, I don't care if you believe me. I don't care if you think I'm insane or desperate or both. Just look at the evidence. Verify what can be verified. And if it's real, if even half of what we've documented is accurate, then do something about it before more people like Edmund Fenwick disappear for trying to serve the kingdom honestly." She closed the satchel. "I'll need time to review this properly. To consult with people I trust who can assess authenticity. We don't have time. Crown Intelligence has probably already tracked us to this region. Staying means capture or death." Then you'll have to trust that I care more about the kingdom than about protecting powerful people who've been lying to my father." She straightened, and suddenly the young woman with paint-stained hands transformed into someone who carried royal authority like a weapon. "Stay here. I'll arrange secure transport to the capital. You'll testify before my father directly." "That's suicide. Voss controls security. She'll arrange an accident before we reach the palace."
"Not if I invoke royal protection." The princess's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "You've put your lives at risk to bring this evidence."
"The least I can do is ensure you survive long enough to see whether truth actually matters in this kingdom." Before Cedric could respond, one of the guards shouted a warning. "Movement in the trees." Multiple hostiles approaching from the north perimeter. Everyone moved at once. The guards rushed toward the princess while more soldiers emerged from the estate. Cedric grabbed Alara's arm, pulling her back toward the forest as arrows started hitting trees around them. But these weren't estate guards, these were crown guard, professional military operating with the kind of coordination that suggested they'd been tracking Cedric's position and had just been waiting for optimal engagement conditions. Voss's people had found them. The princess was shouting orders, her guards forming a defensive perimeter while trying to extract her toward the estate. Cedric and Alara ran toward the tree line as soldiers closed from multiple directions. They made it maybe 50 yards before the trap became obvious. More soldiers emerged from the forest ahead, cutting off escape routes. Behind them, Crown Guard advanced with the methodical precision of professionals executing a well-planned capture operation. They were surrounded. Cedric drew his sword, knowing it was pointless, but unable to surrender after 5 weeks of refusing to accept inevitable outcomes. Alara had her pistol out, face set with determination that looked exactly like her father's had during the last conversation Cedric had witnessed before Edmund Fenwick disappeared forever. Then a voice cut through the chaos. "Enough!" Everyone froze. Chancellor Helena Voss emerged from the soldiers like a spider from its web. She was 60 years old, built like someone who'd spent decades proving women could be just as ruthlessly effective as men in acquiring and maintaining power. Her gray hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes held the kind of cold intelligence that had outwitted every rival for 20 years. She walked towards Cedric with the confidence of someone who'd already won and was just collecting prizes. "Duke Ravenscar," she said pleasantly. "Or should I say the late Duke Ravenscar, since you're officially deceased?" She stopped 10 feet away, just outside sword range. "You've been remarkably persistent for a dead man. I admire that, even if it's been extraordinarily inconvenient." Cedric kept his blade steady. "Whatever you're planning won't work. The princess has the evidence. She knows everything." Voss glanced at Princess Mira, who was still surrounded by guards but watching the confrontation with sharp attention. "Yes, unfortunate timing on your part. If you'd approached her tomorrow, I'd have had advance warning and could have prevented this meeting entirely. As it is, we'll need to manage the situation more delicately." She turned back to Cedric. "Here's what's going to happen. You and Lady Fenwick are going to lower your weapons. You're going to surrender peacefully. And then we're going to have a conversation about what happens to evidence gathered by fugitives who've committed multiple crimes, including murder, abduction, and assault on crown officials." "The evidence stands on its own merits," Alara said, voice shaking with rage. "Doesn't matter who gathered it." "Doesn't it?" Voss smiled. "Because from where I'm standing, everything you've collected can be explained as fabrications created by desperate people trying to avoid execution. Corin's documents, probably forged. Thane's testimony? Extracted under duress from a man you kidnapped and threatened." She spread her hands. "You've built a compelling narrative, I'll admit. But narratives require credibility, and fugitives wanted for murder tend to lack that quality." The princess stepped forward despite her guards' protests. "The evidence warrants investigation regardless of source. I'll be presenting it to the king." "Of course you will." Voss's voice was patient, like she was explaining something to a child. "And I'll be presenting context about how these documents were obtained through illegal means by individuals with every motivation to fabricate charges against their accusers. Who do you think your father will believe? His loyal advisor of 20 years, or fugitives who've left a trail of bodies across the northern territories?" Cedric felt something crack inside his chest. Not despair exactly. More like the final breaking of whatever illusion had convinced him that truth mattered in a world designed to reward power above everything else. Voss was right. They'd gathered evidence, extracted testimony, survived impossible odds. And none of it mattered because the person they were trying to expose controlled the very mechanisms that would judge evidence legitimacy. The game had been rigged from the start. He looked at Alara and saw the same realization hitting her. Saw her father's death finally making sense in the worst possible way. Edmund Fenwick hadn't failed because he lacked evidence or made tactical mistakes. He'd failed because corruption at this level was designed to be immune to exposure as long as the people running it controlled the systems meant to check their power. "You can't win," Voss said softly. "You never could. The best you can hope for is surrender now, cooperation with Crown investigation, and perhaps reduce sentences that don't end in execution." She paused. "Or you can die here in the woods, and I'll ensure history records you as exactly the criminals I've always claimed you were. Your choice." Cedric's mind raced through options that all led to the same conclusion. Surrender meant show trials and predetermined outcomes. Fighting meant death. Running meant abandoning everything they'd accomplished to a woman who'd already demonstrated she could bury truth deeper than bodies. There was no winning move, but maybe there was one move that wasn't quite losing. He looked at Princess Mira. "Your Highness, whatever happens to us, that evidence is real. Every document, every testimony. Verify it independently and you'll find connections that prove the corruption exists." He raised his voice so every soldier could hear. "Chancellor Voss has spent 20 years building a network that's stolen millions from the kingdom while eliminating anyone who got close to exposing it. Edmund Fenwick died because he discovered the truth. Dozens of others died to cover up his death. And now she's trying to kill us because we finished what he started." The words hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be unspoken. Voss's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. A calculation adjusting for new variables. "Touching speech," she said. "Unfortunately, speeches don't change tactical realities. You're still surrounded, outgunned, and legally classified as enemies of the crown." She gestured at the soldiers. "Take them into custody. Lethal force authorized if they resist." The soldiers moved forward in formation. Cedric raised his sword, knowing it was futile but unable to surrender after everything. Then Alara grabbed his arm. "Wait." He looked at her. Saw something in her expression that suggested she'd just realized an angle he'd missed. She raised her voice, speaking not to Voss but to the princess. "Your Highness, we have Lord Thane secured at a location only we know. He's wounded and will die without medical intervention within days. If we're killed or captured, you lose the only witness willing to testify about the corruption network's operations. If Chancellor Voss is as innocent as she claims, she should welcome the opportunity to have Thane's accusations proven false through proper investigation." It was a desperate gambit, but it changed the math enough that everyone paused. Voss's expression tightened fractionally. "Lord Thane is a known criminal who will say anything to avoid execution. His testimony is worthless. Then you should have no problem with him testifying before the king under proper procedures," Alara countered, "unless you're afraid his testimony might actually be verified." The princess looked between them, processing the implications. If Lord Thane is genuinely willing to testify about corruption, he deserves protection to do so safely. Royal protection, not custody by people he's accused of criminal conspiracy. "That's not protocol," Voss began. "I'm invoking royal privilege." The princess's voice cut like a blade. "These prisoners will be placed under my personal custody pending investigation. Chancellor, you'll refrain from any action against them until my father has reviewed the evidence and heard Thane's testimony directly. Your Highness, with respect, you're exceeding your authority. My authority derives from the crown itself." Princess Mira stepped closer to Voss, and suddenly, 25 years of being underestimated transformed into something sharp enough to draw blood. "You can challenge my decision before my father, but doing so requires explaining why you're opposed to investigating corruption allegations against yourself. How do you think that conversation will play?" The two women locked eyes in a contest of wills that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with power dynamics Cedric couldn't fully track. Finally, Voss smiled. "Of course, Your Highness, I merely sought to ensure proper security protocols were followed. If you wish to take custody of these prisoners, that's certainly within your authority." She glanced at Cedric. "Though I do hope you'll maintain adequate precautions. They're quite dangerous despite their current disadvantages." Princess Mira gestured at her guards. "Secure them. Full restraints. They're not to be harmed, but they're not to be trusted either." She looked at Cedric. "You'll be held at a secure location while evidence is reviewed. If your claims prove accurate, you'll testify before the king. If they prove false, you'll face justice for crimes committed regardless of motivations." "Understood," Cedric said. Soldiers moved forward to bind their hands. Cedric didn't resist, though every instinct screamed at him to fight or run or do something besides accepting custody from a system he'd spent 5 weeks trying to circumvent. As they were led toward carriages that would take them to whatever secure location the princess controlled, Voss called out one last time, "Duke Ravenscar." Cedric turned. She was still smiling that terrible smile that said she'd already won and was just waiting for everyone else to realize it. "You've been quite impressive. But I've been playing this game since before you understood what power meant. Whatever you think you've accomplished here, I promise you it won't end the way you hope." Then she walked back toward the soldiers, issuing orders in a voice too low to hear, but commanding enough that everyone immediately obeyed. Alara leaned close as they were loaded into separate carriages. Did we just win or lose? Cedric watched Voss coordinate her forces with the efficiency of someone who'd been orchestrating moves for 2 decades. "I have absolutely no idea," saying. The secure location turned out to be a fortress built into cliffs overlooking the ocean. Old construction, predating current dynasty. The kind of place designed to withstand sieges by armies that no longer existed. They were placed in cells that were clean but absolutely secure. Stone walls 3 feet thick, single barred window looking out at nothing but water. Guards rotating every 6 hours with procedures that prevented them from developing any relationship with prisoners. Professional imprisonment designed to ensure escape was impossible without outside help. Days passed without information. No updates on evidence review. No news about whether Thane had been recovered or was dead in that mountain hut. No indication whether the princess was genuinely investigating or just performing due diligence before handing them over to Voss's justice. Cedric spent the time reviewing every decision that had led to this cell. Every choice that had seemed necessary at the time, but might have been just another step toward inevitable failure. He'd wanted to expose corruption. He'd wanted to finish what Edmund Fenwick started. He'd wanted to believe that truth mattered enough to fight for, even when fighting meant destroying whatever remained of his life. And he'd ended up exactly where powerful people wanted him. Contained, controlled, waiting for them to decide whether he lived or died. The door opened on the 7th day. Guards entered, followed by Princess Mira herself. She looked tired, like someone who'd spent a week discovering that everything she thought she understood about power structures was built on foundations of lies and manipulation. "We recovered Lord Thane," she said without preamble. "He's receiving medical care and has provided extensive testimony corroborating your evidence." She paused. "We also located your companion Marcus. He's alive, barely, being treated at a secure medical facility." Cedric felt relief so intense it was almost painful. "And the evidence is being verified through independent sources. Initial results confirm substantial portions of the financial irregularities you documented." She moved closer to the bars. "Chancellor Voss has been placed under house arrest pending formal investigation. Several other officials connected to the corruption network have been detained for questioning. That's more than I expected. It's less than this kingdom deserves." Her voice was bitter. "My father spent 20 years trusting a woman who was systematically stealing from the crown and eliminating anyone who discovered the truth. Edmund Fenwick wasn't the first. He was just the most recent in a long line of people who died trying to serve honestly. Will Voss face justice?" The princess's expression suggested she was wrestling with realities Cedric understood too well. "That depends on whether we can build a case strong enough to overcome her political connections and the institutional protection corruption provides its architects." She meets his eyes. "What you need to understand is that even if we prove everything, even if we expose the full scope of the network, Voss has allies at every level of government, people whose positions depend on the system she built. They'll fight to protect her because letting her fall means acknowledging their own complicity. So she might survive this anyway. She might. Or she might fall but take half the government down with her, creating chaos that makes the corruption look preferable to civil war." She paused. "Power isn't just about truth, Duke Ravenscar. It's about maintaining structures stable enough that society functions. Sometimes that means accepting injustice because the alternative is worse." Cedric understood the logic, had employed it himself for years as Duke, making calculated compromises that prioritized stability over righteousness. But something had changed during 5 weeks of being dead. Some part of him had stopped accepting that stability built on corruption was worth protecting. Your Highness, with respect, that's exactly the philosophy that allowed this to happen in the first place. The moment you start accepting injustice for practical reasons, you create permission for more injustice. Eventually, the entire system becomes corrupted because everyone's making small compromises that seem reasonable individually, but compound into something monstrous. I know. Her voice was soft. Believe me, I know. That's why I need you to testify before my father and the full Crown Council, to make them see what accepting compromise has cost this kingdom. When? 3 days. She turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. Chancellor Voss sent a message this morning from her house arrest. She's requesting a private meeting with you before the testimony. Why? She claims she has information about your brother's death that will contextualize everything you think you know about Ravenscar's history. Cedric went very still. My brother committed suicide 15 years ago. Did he? Princess Mira's expression was unreadable. Or is that what you were told? The meeting took place in a room designed for interrogations. Table bolted to the floor, chairs that couldn't be used as weapons, guards on both sides of the only door. Chancellor Helena Voss sat across from Cedric, looking remarkably composed for someone under house arrest, facing potential execution. Her gray hair was still perfectly arranged. Her clothes were expensive, but understated. She had the appearance of someone who'd been inconvenienced by false accusations, but remained confident truth would prevail. Duke Ravenscar. She smiled. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I didn't agree. I was informed you had information about my brother. I do. But first, I want you to understand something about the situation you've created. She folded her hands on the table. You've exposed a corruption network that's been operating for 20 years. Congratulations. You've also destabilized the entire Northern administration, created political chaos that will take years to resolve, and ensured that dozens of people, many of them competent administrators, whose only crime was accepting payments to supplement inadequate salaries, will lose their positions or face prosecution. If they were competent, they wouldn't have needed bribes. Competence and compensation are separate issues. Voss's voice was patient. The kingdom doesn't pay administrators adequately. It never has. So capable people accept outside income to maintain lifestyles appropriate to their positions. That's not corruption. That's economic reality. It's literally the definition of corruption. It's the definition of a system functioning as it always has. She leaned forward. Here's what you don't understand because you've spent the last month playing revolutionary. Governments don't run on ideals. They run on compromises, accommodations, and quiet arrangements that keep everything functioning despite official rules that are impossible to follow. What you call corruption, I call practical administration. What you call criminal conspiracy, I call networking that ensures competent people maintain positions regardless of political changes. You killed Edmund Fenwick. I prevented him from destroying a functional system over ideological objections. He wanted to expose arrangements that would have created administrative chaos, budget shortfalls, and political crises. I made a difficult decision to protect institutional stability. You murdered him. I eliminated a threat to the kingdom's operational effectiveness. Voss's expression didn't change, and if you force this investigation to its conclusion, you'll eliminate hundreds of administrators who keep the government running. You'll create vacuums that get filled by incompetent loyalists who pass ideological tests but can't actually perform their jobs. You'll destabilize the entire administrative structure for the sake of abstract principles about honesty that have never been how governments actually operate. Cedric stared at her and saw something worse than evil. He saw someone who genuinely believed every word, who'd convinced herself that corruption was just pragmatic administration. That murder was just threat elimination. The 20 years of theft and killing and manipulation were all justified by maintaining stability. She wasn't a monster. She was something more dangerous, a true believer in a philosophy that rationalized horror through competent execution. You said you had information about my brother. I do. Voss pulled a folded document from inside her coat. Your brother didn't commit suicide. He was killed on your father's orders because he was investigating financial irregularities in House Ravenscar's accounts. Irregularities that would have exposed your family's own involvement in the very corruption networks you're now so desperate to destroy. She slid the document across the table. Autopsy report. Suppressed at your father's request. shows poisoning consistent with forced ingestion, not self-administration. Your brother discovered that House Ravenscar had been accepting payments from northern mining operations in exchange for reduced tax assessments. When he threatened to expose it, your father had him eliminated to protect the family reputation. Cedric picked up the document with hands that wanted to shake but refused. The information was detailed, clinical, damning, either incredibly well forged or genuinely authentic. Why show me this? Because I want you to understand that everyone is compromised, Voss said quietly. Your family, my administration, the princess's beloved father. Everyone with power has made compromises that look like corruption if you examine them closely enough. The only difference between us is I'm honest about the nature of governance, while you pretend there's some moral high ground to occupy. She stood. Tomorrow you'll testify before the Crown Council. You'll present your evidence and your accusations. And whatever they decide, you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that everything you fought for was built on the same foundation of lies and compromise you condemn. Your brother died because your father was protecting exactly the kind of corrupt arrangements you're trying to expose. You're not fighting corruption, Duke Ravenscar. You're fighting human nature. And human nature always wins. She left, guards escorting her out, leaving Cedric alone with a document that suggested his entire campaign had been built on a hypocrisy he'd been too self-righteous to recognize. He sat there for a long time, holding his brother's suppressed autopsy report. And for the first time since crawling out of that tunnel 5 weeks ago, he wondered if maybe Voss was right. If maybe corruption wasn't an aberration to be eliminated, but just the inevitable result of power structures populated by humans who'd rather compromise principles than face consequences. If maybe fighting it was just another form of delusion maintained by people who couldn't accept that the world had always been exactly this broken and always would be. The door opened. Princess Mira entered, took one look at his face, and knew something had shifted. What did she tell you? The truth, probably. Or a lie so well constructed it might as well be truth. He set down the document. Doesn't matter either way. Tomorrow I testify. We finish what we started. And then we see whether truth actually changes anything or just gets more people killed for believing it matters. The princess picked up the document, read it, and set it down carefully. Even if this is true, it doesn't invalidate your fight against Voss's corruption, doesn't it? If my own family was compromised, if I spent years benefiting from the same system I'm now condemning, what gives me the right to demand others face justice? The same thing that gives anyone that right. The belief that acknowledging corruption is better than accepting it. That trying to fix broken systems is better than maintaining them because fixing seems too hard. She moved to the window. My father will hear your testimony tomorrow. The council will review evidence, and then they'll decide whether exposing 20 years of corruption is worth the administrative chaos it creates. She turned back to him. I can't guarantee the outcome, but I can guarantee that if you don't testify, nothing changes. Voss maintains power. The network continues operating. And everyone who died trying to stop it died for nothing. Cedric felt the weight of choices that all led to consequences he couldn't predict or control. Testify and maybe expose corruption at the cost of destabilizing the kingdom. Stay silent and maybe prevent chaos at the cost of accepting that powerful people could murder and steal without consequence. There was no right answer, just a choice between different kinds of failure. He stood. Tomorrow, then. We'll see whether truth is actually stronger than the people who profit from burying it. The princess nodded and left, guards locking the door behind her. Cedric returned to his window overlooking the ocean and thought about his brother, dead 15 years, killed either by his own hand or their father's order, depending on which version of events you believed. Thought about Edmund Fenwick, disappeared for discovering corruption that might have been the same corruption Cedric's family participated in. Thought about Marcus, lying in a medical facility somewhere fighting infections because he'd been loyal to a commander who'd led him into a war that might accomplish nothing except confirming that powerful people always survived and idealists always died. Thought about whether anything he'd done in the last 5 weeks mattered at all, and realized with cold clarity that it didn't matter whether it mattered. He was going to testify anyway, was going to finish what Edmund Fenwick started, was going to drag corruption into daylight and make powerful people defend themselves publicly regardless of whether it changed anything. Not because he thought he'd win, but because the alternative, accepting that corruption was just how things worked and that fighting it was naive, was a form of death worse than anything Voss could order. Tomorrow he'd walk into the Crown Council and testify about 20 years of systematic theft and murder.
And then he'd see whether a kingdom that had spent 2 decades accepting comfortable lies could handle uncomfortable truth. The odds weren't good, but they'd never been good. And somehow he'd survived this long anyway, which suggested that maybe impossible things were just difficult things no one had been desperate enough to attempt properly. Outside his window, the ocean crashed against cliffs that had been standing for centuries and would keep standing long after everyone currently alive was dust and memory. Permanence was an illusion. Power was temporary. Truth was just another weapon people used when it served them and buried when it didn't. But conviction, the stubborn refusal to accept that compromise and corruption were inevitable, that was something you could maintain even when everything else fell apart. It wouldn't save him, but maybe it would matter to someone else who'd eventually face the same choice between accepting injustice and fighting it. That was all anyone could hope for, really. To matter enough that the fight continued even after you lost. The Crown Council chamber was built to intimidate. Vaulted ceilings that made voices echo like pronouncements from gods. Marble columns carved with the names of kings who'd ruled before memory became history. Walls lined with portraits of nobles whose bloodlines had shaped kingdoms through war, marriage, and murder conducted with enough sophistication that historians called it politics instead. Cedric entered in chains, not decorative restraints meant to suggest control while maintaining dignity, real iron shackles that cut into wrists already scarred from 5 weeks of survival that had ground away everything except the core of who he'd become when titles and power stopped mattering. 2 guards flanked him, hands on weapons, ready to put him down if he so much as breathed wrong. The council sat in a semicircle facing the center of the chamber where prisoners stood to be judged. 23 nobles representing the kingdom's major territories and power structures. Men and women who'd spent decades accumulating influence through the same compromises and accommodations that Voss had systematized into organized corruption. At the center sat King Aldrich himself, 70 years old, spine still straight despite the weight of 4 decades wearing a crown that had executed 3 of his predecessors for weakness. His face was all sharp angles and cold assessment, the kind of face that had ordered executions before breakfast and slept soundly afterward because necessary violence had never bothered him. Princess Mira stood to his right, dressed in formal court attire that transformed her from the painter in the woods into someone who carried royal authority like a blade sheathed but ready. Her expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing about whether the past week of evidence review had strengthened or weakened their case. And there, seated among the council members with the composure of someone attending a mildly interesting theater performance, was Chancellor Helena Voss. Still under house arrest technically, but present because apparently house arrest for powerful people meant inconvenience rather than actual confinement. She wore dark blue silk that probably cost more than most citizens earned in a year, and her gray hair was arranged with the kind of precision that suggested she'd spent this morning preparing for battle that would be conducted through words instead of weapons. She met Cedric's eyes and smiled slightly, a small expression that said she'd already won and was just waiting for everyone else to realize it. King Aldrich raised one hand and the chamber fell silent with the absolute obedience that came from. Generations of understanding that kings who maintained power for 40 years didn't tolerate disruption. Cedric Ravenscar, the king's voice, was surprisingly strong for his age. You stand accused of numerous crimes, including murder, abduction, assault on crown officials, and conspiracy to undermine royal authority. You've also made accusations against Chancellor Voss suggesting systematic corruption within my administration. He leaned forward slightly. Before sentencing is pronounced, you will be given opportunity to present evidence supporting your claims. Speak. The formal language was all procedure and ritual, but underneath it, Cedric heard the real question. Convince me that 20 years of trusting my closest advisor was a mistake that's cost the kingdom blood and treasure. Convince me I've been a fool. Do it with evidence strong enough to overcome the institutional protections corruption builds around itself. No pressure. Cedric looked at the assembled council and saw faces that had already decided he was guilty. Saw nobles who benefited from the current system and had no interest in exposing flaws that might implicate their own compromises. Saw the machinery of power that had crushed Edmund Fenwick and would crush him too unless he found angles no one expected. Your Majesty, he began, his voice echoing in the vaulted space. 5 weeks ago, I was executed for crimes I didn't commit. The evidence against me was fabricated, the witnesses were bought, and the execution was staged to look like accident because putting me on trial risked exposing information powerful people wanted buried.
I survived through luck and stubbornness. And in the weeks since my supposed death, I've discovered that my frame-up wasn't an isolated incident, but part of systematic operation run by Chancellor Voss to eliminate anyone who threatened her corruption network. Voss stood smoothly.
Your Majesty, if I may address these accusations directly? The king gestured permission.
Duke Ravenscar claims fabricated evidence and bought witnesses, but he offers no proof beyond the words of a fugitive wanted for multiple confirmed murders. Voss's voice was calm, reasonable. He's abducted Lord Thane and extracted testimony under duress. He's killed crown officials who were attempting to execute legal warrants. He's created chaos across the northern territories that's cost lives and damaged commerce. Her expression was almost sympathetic. I understand that facing execution drives people to desperate acts, but desperation doesn't transform criminals into truth-tellers. It just makes them more dangerous. I have documentation, Cedric said. Financial records showing systematic payments from illegal sources to crown officials, including yourself. Communication protocols detailing how the corruption network coordinates operations. Testimony from Lord Thane, who is being treated under royal protection and has provided information freely now that he's safe from your retaliation. Documentation that was stolen during criminal acts. Voss turned to face the council. Any evidence gathered through illegal means is inadmissible in legitimate proceedings. That's foundational principle of justice. Otherwise, anyone could fabricate accusations, commit crimes to gather supporting material, and claim the ends justify the means. The evidence stands regardless of how it was obtained, Princess Mira interjected. The financial irregularities are verifiable through independent audit of Crown accounts. The communication protocols match known patterns of coordination between officials. Lord Thane's testimony provides context that explains years of suspicious deaths and disappeared investigations. Lord Thane is a criminal facing execution who will say anything to avoid that fate. Voss's voice remained steady. Your Highness, with respect, you're allowing personal involvement to cloud your judgment. Just because evidence seems compelling doesn't mean it's accurate. It means it was constructed to seem compelling. King Aldrich raised his hand again. Both of you will have opportunity to present your cases fully. Right now I want to hear from Duke Ravenscar directly. He fixed Cedric with eyes that had stared down rebellion, invasion, and 3 decades of nobles trying to manipulate him. You claim Chancellor Voss orchestrated your frame-up. Why? What possible motivation would she have for eliminating a duke who was by all accounts effective administrator of northern territories? Because I was investigating financial irregularities in crown tax collection, Cedric said. 10 years ago, before Edmund Fenwick began his investigation, I noticed discrepancies in revenue reports from northern mining operations. Money that should have reached Crown Treasury but vanished into administrative expenses that didn't match actual expenditures. I started asking questions, started requesting detailed accounting that would have exposed the payment structures Chancellor Voss had established. That's interesting claim, Voss said quietly, considering you've never mentioned these investigations before. Very convenient to discover this motivation now that you need to explain why I would target you. I didn't mention it because I stopped investigating. Cedric felt the admission like a knife in his own chest. You contacted me privately, suggested that pushing the inquiry would create administrative difficulties that would damage my political standing, implied that everyone at my level accepted certain financial arrangements as the cost of maintaining position. And I believed you, stopped asking questions, spent the next decade telling myself that compromise was necessary for stability. He looked directly at King Aldrich. That's how corruption works, Your Majesty. Not through dramatic conspiracy, but through small compromises that seem reasonable individually. You accept one payment. You ignore one irregularity. You rationalize that everyone does it, and maintaining your position requires playing by rules that exist whether you acknowledge them or not. And before you realize what's happened, you're complicit in a system that's fundamentally broken because breaking it would expose your own compromises. The chamber was silent. Several council members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing themselves in the description. Then why did I eventually target you, Voss asked. If you'd stopped investigating and accepted the arrangements? Because Edmund Fenwick didn't stop. And when he approached me for help, I almost gave it to him. Almost decided that stability wasn't worth protecting if it required accepting systematic theft and murder. Cedric paused. You couldn't risk me having a crisis of conscience. Couldn't take the chance I'd actually help Fenwick expose the network. So you started building a case against me as insurance. planted evidence slowly over years, bought witnesses who could testify to crimes I never committed, created a frame-up so thorough that when you finally activated it, no one questioned whether I was guilty. That's a compelling narrative, Voss said. It's also completely unprovable speculation dressed up as fact. She turned to the council. Duke Ravenscar is a skilled manipulator who's had 5 weeks to construct a story that explains his crimes while making himself seem like victim. Don't let eloquence distract from reality. He's killed people. He's disrupted crown operations. He's created chaos that's damaged the kingdom's stability. Whatever his motivations, those actions demand justice. Then let's examine the evidence, Princess Mira said. She gestured and servants entered carrying boxes of documents. Financial records recovered from Lord Corrin's estate, payment ledgers from Lord Thane's office, communication protocols detailing coordination between officials. All of it authenticated by independent auditors over the past week. She began spreading documents across tables where council members could examine them. Every piece of evidence shows systematic corruption operating at the highest levels of Crown administration. Chancellor Voss's name appears repeatedly. So do the names of several officials present in this chamber. The last statement hit like a weapon detonating in enclosed space. Council members immediately started examining documents with expressions ranging from genuine shock to carefully controlled fear. Several found their own names. Several found evidence of payments they'd accepted or crimes they'd authorized or people they'd eliminated to protect the network. Voss remained standing, composed, but Cedric saw calculation happening behind her eyes. Saw her adjusting strategy in real time as the evidence spread through the council like fire through dry wood. Your Majesty, Voss said, this evidence was gathered through criminal acts and extracted under duress. Regardless of what it seems to show, it's inadmissible. You cannot base decisions on material obtained through methods that violate every principle of legal process. King Aldrich was reading documents with the kind of focus that suggested he was seeing things that violated his understanding of how his own government operated. Helena. His voice was very quiet. These ledgers show payments from your personal accounts to officials throughout my administration. Legitimate payments for consultation services. Voss's voice remained steady. I've maintained relationships with administrators across the kingdom because effective governance requires coordination and communication. Those payments are entirely proper. They're bribes. Princess Mira's voice cut like glass. Payment in exchange for favorable decisions, falsified reports, and elimination of oversight. She held up a specific document. This is a payment order you signed authorizing 10,000 gold crowns to Inquisitor Corrin. The date matches exactly with his closure of the investigation into Edmund Fenwick's disappearance. That's not consultation, that's paying to bury evidence. It's payment for services rendered within his official capacity. He closed an investigation without following standard procedures. He declared a prominent lord dead without recovering a body or interviewing key witnesses. And you paid him immediately afterward. She turned to the king. Father, the evidence is overwhelming. Chancellor Voss has spent 20 years building a corruption network that's infiltrated every level of your administration. She's stolen millions. She's eliminated dozens of people who threatened to expose her. And she's done it all while pretending to serve the crown loyally. King Aldrich set down the documents he was reading. His face was unreadable, but something in his posture suggested he was wrestling with realities he'd spent 2 decades not seeing. Because not seeing was more comfortable than acknowledging how deeply he'd been betrayed. Helena, he said quietly, did you kill Edmund Fenwick? The chamber held its breath. Voss met the king's eyes without flinching. I made a decision in the kingdom's best interest. Lord Fenwick was pursuing an investigation that would have destabilized the administrative structure at a critical time. His evidence was accurate but incomplete. Publishing it would have created chaos without achieving meaningful reform. I chose stability over transparency because I still believe, that effective governance requires difficult decisions that can't always be defended in public forums. So you did kill him. I eliminated a threat to the kingdom's operational effectiveness. Voss's voice was calm, like she was discussing routine administrative decision. The same way you've eliminated threats throughout your reign. The same way every effective ruler eliminates problems that can't be solved through negotiation or accommodation. She spread her hands. You want to call it murder? Fine. I murdered Edmund Fenwick. I also murdered approximately 37 other people over 20 years who threatened to expose arrangements that keep this government functioning.
I've stolen millions that would have been wasted on inefficient programs while using those funds to maintain relationships with officials who actually accomplish things. I've built a network that ensures competent people remain in positions of power, regardless of political changes. And I've done it all while serving you as loyally as anyone in this chamber. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had just consumed whatever pretense of innocence Voss had been maintaining. Cedric watched King Aldrich process the confession, watched him realize that his most trusted advisor had just admitted to systematic murder and theft while claiming it was all in service of his reign. And Cedric saw the terrible decision forming behind the king's eyes. The calculation every ruler eventually faced when betrayal came from someone so deeply embedded in power structures that removing them threatened everything. Several council members were already standing, voices rising in demands for immediate arrest and execution. Others sat silent, recognizing that their own names appeared in evidence and that Voss's fall might drag them down too. The chamber descended into chaos as decades of corrupt arrangements suddenly faced exposure and consequences. Princess Mira moved to her father's side, speaking urgently in tones too low for Cedric to hear, making whatever case she'd been building over the past week about how justice mattered more than stability. Voss remained standing in the center of the chaos, composed as ever, like she was watching a play whose ending she'd already written. Then King Aldrich stood. The chamber fell silent immediately through sheer force of authority that had been accumulating for 40 years. Chancellor Voss, his voice was cold as winter stone. You are removed from your position effective immediately. You will be held under guard pending formal charges of murder, theft, conspiracy, and treason. If evidence supports these accusations, an initial review suggests it does, you will face execution. Voss smiled slightly. Your Majesty, with respect, you won't execute me. The king's expression didn't change. You seem very confident. I'm confident, because I know exactly how many officials in this chamber have accepted my payments. How many have participated in the network? How many have committed their own crimes while operating under my protection? She turned to face the full council. If you execute me, I'll provide testimony that implicates 40% of the people currently serving in Crown administration. I'll detail every crime, every payment, every eliminated witness. I'll burn down the entire structure you've spent 40 years building, Your Majesty, and the chaos that follows will make the corruption look like a golden age by comparison. You're threatening me. I'm stating facts. Power structures don't survive without the people who run them. Execute me and you lose everyone who actually knows how to govern. Promote idealistic replacements who pass purity tests and you'll discover that integrity doesn't translate to competence. She met the king's eyes. You have two choices. Execute me and watch your government collapse into dysfunction, or accept that what I built is necessary, give me a public reprimand for appearances, and allow the system to continue operating as it always has. The king's hand moved to the hilt of the ceremonial sword he wore. For a moment, Cedric thought he might actually draw it and execute Voss right there in front of the council. It would have been dramatic and probably legally justified given the confession she'd just made. But kings who survived 40 years didn't make decisions based on drama. They made decisions based on cold assessment of consequences. And Voss was right. Executing her would create chaos that might be worse than the corruption she'd systematized. Cedric saw the calculation happening, saw the king weighing justice against stability, saw the moment when pragmatism started winning over righteousness, because pragmatism always won when rulers had to actually govern instead of just making speeches about principles. He couldn't let it happen. Couldn't let 5 weeks of survival and sacrifice end with Voss walking away because she'd successfully embedded herself so deeply into power structures that removing her was too complicated to attempt. Your Majesty, Cedric's voice cut through the tense silence. Chancellor Voss is correct that executing her creates complications, but accepting her continued presence creates worse complications. Because every official who participated in her network will know that corruption carries no consequences as long as you're successful enough. Every idealistic administrator will understand that integrity is punished while theft is rewarded. And every citizen will see that powerful people can murder and steal without facing justice. That's a very noble speech, Voss said. It's also naive. Governments don't run on noble principles. They run on practical accommodations with reality. Maybe. But kingdoms that run on practical accommodations with corruption eventually collapse. Cedric looked directly at King Aldrich. Your Majesty, you've ruled for 40 years through strength and calculated pragmatism.
But pragmatism becomes cowardice when it means accepting that justice is too complicated to pursue. Execute Chancellor Voss. Prosecute everyone she implicates. Yes, it'll create chaos. Yes, it'll damage administrative efficiency. But it'll also demonstrate that this kingdom still believes some principles matter more than convenience. The king stared at him for a long moment. Then, "And what happens when I lose half my government and can't find qualified replacements?" You promote people who were previously excluded because they refuse to participate in corruption. You accept that the transition will be difficult but necessary. And you trust that a kingdom built on justice, even imperfect justice executed through difficult transitions, is stronger than one built on accommodating systematic theft and murder. That's asking me to gamble my kingdom's stability on optimistic assumptions about human nature. No, it's asking you to gamble that doing the right thing matters more than doing the easy thing. Cedric felt the weight of 5 weeks pressing down. Every choice, every compromise he'd refused to make. Every time he'd chosen difficult truth over comfortable lies. I spent 20 years as Duke making pragmatic decisions that prioritized stability over righteousness. It turned me into someone who accepted corruption because fighting it seemed too complicated. And it cost me everything. My title, my territory, nearly my life. The only reason I'm standing here is because I finally decided some things were worth losing everything for. He gestured at Voss. She's offering you the same choice I faced. Accept that corruption is just how things work. Make peace with the compromises that seem necessary. Rationalize that stability matters more than justice. And wake up 20 years from now realizing you've built a kingdom that functions efficiently while having no soul worth protecting. The chamber was absolutely silent. Every eye was on King Aldrich, waiting to see whether 40 years of pragmatic rule would give way to something more dangerous, the belief that justice actually mattered. The king's hand remained on his sword hilt. His face was still unreadable, but Cedric saw something shift behind his eyes, some calculation rebalancing, some decision forming that would determine not just Voss's fate, but the direction of the entire kingdom. Then the doors at the back of the chamber exploded inward. Not metaphorically, literally exploded with enough force to send oak and iron fragments flying across marble floors. Through the smoke and debris came soldiers wearing the crimson and black of Voss's personal guard, not crown guard, not royal protection. Private forces loyal to the Chancellor, who'd apparently decided that if legal processes wouldn't save her, violence would. They came fast and professional, spreading through the chamber with the kind of coordination that suggested they'd been positioned outside specifically for this contingency. 20 men with drawn weapons moving to secure the council and extract Voss before anyone could stop them. The king's guards reacted immediately, but were outnumbered and surprised. Steel rang against steel. Someone screamed. Blood splattered across marble that had been white since before anyone present was born. Princess Mira grabbed her father and pulled him back behind a column, while her personal guard formed a protective barrier. Council members scattered, some trying to escape, others drawing weapons if they were the type of noble who still remembered how to use them. Voss moved toward her soldiers, still composed, like this was contingency plan she'd prepared years ago and was simply executing now that circumstances required it. Cedric's guards had been knocked aside in the initial explosion. His chains were still locked, but his hands were free enough to grab a sword from a fallen soldier. He didn't think about what he was doing, didn't calculate odds or plan strategy. Just moved toward Voss with the kind of focused violence that came from 5 weeks of surviving through pure stubbornness. She saw him coming. Her expression flickered from composed to something almost like respect. Then she pulled a small crossbow from inside her coat and fired. The bolt took Cedric in the shoulder, the same shoulder that had been wounded during the tunnel escape and had never properly healed. Pain exploded through nerve endings that were already damaged, and he went down on one knee. Voss walked toward him while her soldiers held back the king's guards. "You had your chance to be pragmatic," she said. "Could have accepted that survival requires compromise. Instead, you chose to be idealistic. It's a character flaw that tends to be fatal." She raised the crossbow for a second shot. Then Alara crashed into her from the side. Cedric hadn't seen Alara enter the chamber, hadn't known she was even out of custody. But apparently Princess Mira had made arrangements, because Alara was there with a knife in her hand and 7 years of rage-fueling movements that were more survival instinct than technique. They went down together, rolling across marble while the battle raged around them. Voss was older but trained, and she fought with the efficiency of someone who'd been eliminating threats personally long before she'd had subordinates to handle it. Alara was younger and anger made you dangerous when you'd spent years learning to channel it into productive violence.
The knife flashed. Blood appeared. Cedric couldn't tell whose blood, couldn't get a clear angle to help because his shoulder was screaming and the chains made movement awkward. Then Voss's boot caught Alara in the ribs hard enough to crack something. Alara rolled away gasping, and Voss stood with the knife now in her hand instead of Alara's.
She advanced on Alara with the same clinical detachment she'd brought to every decision over 20 years. No anger, no cruelty, just the elimination of a problem through the most efficient means available. Cedric forced himself to stand despite the pain. Forced himself to move even though every step felt like someone was driving hot metal through his shoulder. He reached Voss 2 steps before she reached Alara and drove his sword through her back hard enough that the point emerged from her chest. Voss stopped, looked down at the blade protruding from her body, then turned her head to look at Cedric with an expression of mild surprise.
"Well," she said, her voice already weakening, "I suppose that's one way to end the debate about pragmatism versus principles." She collapsed forward, the sword pulling free as she fell. Blood spread across white marble in patterns that looked like abstract art. If you didn't know, it was a human life draining away. The chamber fell silent as Voss's soldiers realized their commander was dead. Some immediately dropped weapons and surrendered. Others tried to fight their way out and were cut down by King's guards who'd rallied once the initial surprise passed. It was over in less than 3 minutes from the initial explosion to Voss's last breath. Cedric knelt beside Alara, checking her ribs with hands that were shaking from adrenaline and blood loss. She was conscious, breathing, probably had fractures, but nothing immediately life-threatening. "You came back," he said. She coughed, winced. "Someone had to make sure you didn't die stupidly before justice happened." Though I'm starting to think maybe dying stupidly is just your preferred approach to problem solving. It's worked so far. You've been clinically dead twice in 5 weeks. That's not working. That's surviving through spite. Fair point? The king emerged from behind the column where Princess Mira had protected him. He looked at Voss's body, looked at the chaos in his council chamber, looked at Cedric, who was still kneeling in chains with a crossbow bolt through his shoulder and blood soaking through clothes that had seen too many fights. "Remove his restraints," the king ordered. Guards moved forward to unlock the chains. The metal fell away and Cedric's arms felt simultaneously lighter and heavier as circulation returned to wrists that had been bound for too long. King Aldrich moved to stand over Voss's body. "She served me for 20 years. I trusted her with the kingdom's most sensitive matters. And apparently she spent that entire time stealing, murdering, and corrupting every institution I thought I controlled." He looked at Cedric. "You were right. Pragmatism becomes cowardice when it means accepting that justice is too complicated to pursue." The admission hung in the air like absolution neither of them deserved. "Your Majesty," Princess Mira said quietly, "we need to address the council members who participated in the corruption network. The evidence implicates dozens of officials. If we prosecute all of them, we prosecute all of them," the king interrupted. "I don't care if it creates chaos. I don't care if we lose half the government." He looked around at council members who were trying very hard to be invisible. Any official found to have accepted bribes, falsified reports, or participated in eliminating witnesses will face charges. Those who cooperate fully and provide testimony will receive reduced sentences. Those who resist will face the full consequences of their actions. He turned back to Cedric. "Duke Ravenscar, you are hereby pardoned for all crimes committed during your investigation of Chancellor Voss's corruption network. House Ravenscar is restored with all territories and rights you held prior to your arrest." He paused. "You'll also be appointed to temporary position overseeing the investigation and prosecution of corrupt officials. Someone needs to coordinate the chaos, and you've demonstrated a commitment to justice that apparently survived being executed." Cedric heard the words but had trouble processing them. Pardoned, restored, given authority to finish what he'd started. It was everything he should have wanted, everything that 5 weeks of survival should have been building toward. And all he felt was exhaustion so profound it made standing difficult. "Your Majesty, I appreciate the pardon and restoration, but I'm not qualified to coordinate investigations. I've spent 5 weeks killing people and stealing evidence. That doesn't translate to administrative competence. You've also spent 5 weeks refusing to compromise, when compromise would have been easier. That's exactly the quality I need in someone rebuilding institutions that were corrupted through decades of accepting easy compromises." The king's voice was firm. This isn't a request. It's an order. You wanted justice to matter more than convenience? Congratulations. You're now responsible for making that actually happen, instead of just making speeches about it. Before Cedric could respond, a guard entered through the destroyed doors and approached the king. Your Majesty, urgent message from the northern fortress. It's about Captain Marcus Thorne. The guard's expression suggested the message wasn't good news. Cedric felt something cold settle in his chest. What happened? His condition deteriorated overnight. The physicians did everything possible, but the infection from his wound had spread too far. He died approximately 3 hours ago. The guard paused. He left a message for Duke Ravenscar. The guard handed over a folded paper sealed with wax. Cedric opened it with hands that wanted to shake but refused. The handwriting was rough, obviously written by someone in extreme pain, barely maintaining enough control to form letters. It read, "You lived. That means something mattered. Don't waste it." MT 4 sentences. That was all Marcus had left after 15 years of loyalty and friendship and following Cedric through every bad decision that had led to. A medical facility where he died alone from wounds that should have been treated properly if they'd had resources they never possessed. Cedric folded the message carefully and put it inside his coat next to Edmund Fenwick's journal. Another debt. Another person who'd died because he'd convinced them the fight was worth attempting. Princess Mira touched his arm gently. He believed in what you were doing. That's why he stayed loyal even when it cost him everything. I know, Cedric's voice was rough. Doesn't make his death less my responsibility. No. But it makes his death mean something. She gestured at the chaos in the council chamber. All of this, the exposure, the justice, the reconstruction, it happens because people like Marcus and my father and you decided that truth mattered enough to die for. That's not wasted. That's exactly what makes civilizations worth protecting. The king was issuing orders to guards, coordinating the arrest of council members whose names appeared in evidence. The remaining nobles who weren't implicated were organizing themselves into provisional authority that would keep government functioning while corruption was purged. It was chaos, but it was purposeful chaos. The kind that came from tearing down broken systems so something better could be built. Cedric looked at Alara, who was being helped to her feet by physicians despite her protests that she was fine. Looked at Princess Mira, who was coordinating with guards while simultaneously managing her father's transition from shock to action. Looked at the destroyed doors and the blood on marble and Voss's body being covered with a cloth, because even corrupt chancellors deserved basic dignity in death. He thought about his brother, killed either by his own hand or their father's order, depending on which version of truth you accepted. Thought about Edmund Fenwick, disappeared into whatever grave Voss had arranged. Thought about Marcus, dead from wounds suffered during an operation that had finally exposed the corruption that had been killing good people for decades. Thought about whether any of it mattered in a world where doing the right thing cost everything, and most people still chose comfortable lies over difficult truth. Then he remembered that he didn't actually care if it mattered to most people. He only cared if it mattered to him. If he could look at himself and know that when circumstances forced the choice between comfortable corruption and difficult justice, he'd chosen justice even when it meant losing everything. That was all anyone could really control, not outcomes, not whether other people valued truth, just whether you personally maintained integrity when every incentive pushed toward compromise. It wouldn't bring back Marcus or Edmund or his brother or the dozens of others who died fighting systems designed to crush anyone who challenged them. But it might prevent the next person from dying alone for trying to serve honestly. That would have to be enough. Cedric turned to King Aldrich. Your Majesty, I'll coordinate the investigation and prosecution of corrupt officials. But I want it on record that I'm doing this because it matters, not because I think it'll succeed completely. Corruption is built into power structures through human nature. We'll purge what we can, but some of it will survive and rebuild and be a problem for the next generation to address. I know. The king's voice was tired. That's why it's called governance instead of resolution. You don't solve problems permanently. You just manage them well enough that society continues functioning between crises. Then let's manage this one properly. Cedric moved toward the doors despite the pain radiating from his shoulder. Let's make sure everyone involved in Voss's network faces consequences. Let's rebuild institutions with people who actually believe integrity matters. And let's do it publicly enough that citizens see their government taking responsibility for decades of corruption instead of just covering it up and moving forward like nothing happened. That's ambitious. That's necessary. Cedric looked back at the king. You ruled for 40 years through strength and pragmatism. But kingdoms remember how their rulers responded to betrayal and crisis more than how they managed prosperity. This is your chance to be remembered as someone who valued justice above convenience. Don't waste it by accepting compromises that future historians will judge harshly. The king smiled slightly. You're telling me how to be remembered favorably by history? You've been dead twice and pardoned once. You're not exactly a model of political longevity. No, but I'm proof that sometimes the people who survive long enough to see change are the ones who stopped caring about survival more than doing what's right. Before the king could respond, more guards entered with reports of Voss's soldiers surrendering throughout the palace complex. The immediate military threat was over. Now came the harder part. The investigations, the trials, the reconstruction of institutions that had been corrupted for so long that many officials genuinely didn't understand they were doing anything wrong. It would take months, probably years. Some of the corrupt would escape justice through political connections or simple competence at hiding evidence. Some of the innocent would get caught in investigations and have their careers destroyed by proximity to guilty parties. It would be messy and imperfect and exactly the kind of complicated process that made people long for simpler times when corruption at least made the government function efficiently. But it would be justice. Imperfect and difficult, but genuine. An attempt to hold powerful people accountable instead of just accepting that power insulated you from consequences. That was all anyone could really ask for. Not perfect outcomes, but honest attempts that might inspire others to keep fighting even when fighting seemed pointless. Cedric walked out of the council chamber into corridors that would never look the same now that he'd seen behind the facade of order and authority. The kingdom would survive this crisis, would rebuild and continue, but it would do so knowing that corruption had consequences, that truth sometimes mattered more than stability, and that ordinary people who refused to accept injustice could occasionally force change even when every institution opposed them. He'd started this journey 5 weeks ago by dying in a tunnel under a fortress that was built to last forever and hadn't even survived his frame-up. He was ending it by accepting responsibility for rebuilding systems that would also eventually fail because nothing built by humans survived the flaws inherent in human nature. But between the collapse and the next failure, there would be years where justice mattered more than convenience, where people served honestly because dishonesty carried real consequences, where the kingdom functioned not perfectly, but better than it had under systematic corruption that had rotted institutions from within. That window of better, however brief, was what Marcus had died for, what Edmund Fenwick had died for, what Cedric had been willing to die for when dying seemed like the only option that preserved any shred of integrity. They'd won. Not completely, not permanently, but enough that the next person who tried to expose corruption wouldn't have to start from zero, would have precedent showing that sometimes truth defeated power even when power seemed invincible. That precedent was worth 5 weeks of hell and more deaths than Cedric wanted to count. Worth every compromise he'd refused and every comfortable lie he'd rejected. Worth becoming someone he hadn't recognized when he looked in mirrors or made decisions that prioritized righteousness over survival. Worth dying for. Worth living for. Worth fighting for even when winning seemed impossible and losing looked like the only rational outcome. In the corridor behind him, Princess Mira called out, "Duke Ravenscar, the first council session for investigating officials starts tomorrow morning. You should probably prepare." Cedric turned back to face her. "I've been preparing for 5 weeks. Tomorrow I'm just making it official." She smiled, genuine warmth that transformed her face from stern royal authority into someone who looked young enough to still believe change was possible. "My father died trying to make this kingdom better. Captain Thorne died making it happen. You survived to finish what they started. Don't let their deaths be for nothing." "I won't." And with that promise hanging in the air like an oath that couldn't be broken without violating everything that mattered, Cedric walked toward whatever came next, knowing that the easy part was over and the real work was just beginning. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. 6 months after Chancellor Voss died on the council chamber floor,
Cedric stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking territories he'd once controlled with absolute authority and now administered with something closer to careful stewardship. The northern province stretched below him in shades of green and gray, villages rebuilding from damage that had nothing to do with his investigation and everything to do with decades of systematic theft that had diverted resources meant for infrastructure into private accounts. The view hadn't changed. The land looked the same as it had when he'd been Duke with unquestioned power and the illusion of control. But everything beneath the surface was different now, and Cedric had learned that surfaces were just comfortable lies. People told themselves to avoid confronting how deeply broken most things actually were. Behind him, the temporary administrative building that served as regional headquarters hummed with the kind of organized chaos that came from rebuilding institutions from scratch. Investigators interviewing former officials. Accountants tracing money that had been stolen so systematically that recovering it required untangling decades of falsified records. Judges reviewing cases where corrupt administrators had perverted justice for personal gain, deciding which convictions to overturn and which to maintain, despite procedural irregularities that made everything questionable. It was exhausting work that produced incremental progress, measured in corrected ledgers and revised policies, rather than dramatic victories. The kind of work that made people nostalgic for simpler times when corruption at least made things function efficiently, even if that efficiency came at the cost of countless lives destroyed through systematic injustice. Cedric had discovered that destroying corruption was significantly easier than rebuilding what corruption had hollowed out. Voss had been right about that much. You could expose systematic theft and murder. You could prosecute guilty parties and seize stolen assets. But you couldn't instantly recreate institutional competence that took decades to develop, and you couldn't replace experienced administrators with idealistic newcomers who lacked the practical knowledge to actually govern effectively. So you made compromises. Hired people who'd been peripherally involved in the corruption network because they at least understood how systems functioned. Accepted that some stolen money would never be recovered because tracing it was more expensive than the recovery value. Acknowledged that perfect justice was impossible, and settled for approximate justice that felt inadequate but was better than nothing. The pragmatism he'd rejected so absolutely during 5 weeks of survival had crept back in through necessity. Not the same pragmatism that accepted systematic corruption as inevitable, but pragmatism that recognized governing required accepting imperfect outcomes because perfect solutions didn't exist in systems populated by flawed humans. It was uncomfortable. A constant tension between the ideals that had driven him to expose Voss and the practical realities that made implementing those ideals frustratingly complicated. But discomfort, Cedric had learned, was just the price of caring about outcomes instead of just making dramatic gestures that felt righteous, but accomplished nothing sustainable. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Alara approaching. She walked with a slight limp now, legacy of the ribs Voss had cracked during their final confrontation. The physicians had set the bones properly, but some injuries just left permanent marks. Physical reminders of costs paid for trying to change systems designed to resist change. She stopped beside him and looked out over the valley. Rough morning? Rough 6 months. Cedric rubbed his shoulder where the crossbow bolt had gone through. The wound had healed but ached whenever weather changed, which meant it ached constantly in the northern territories where weather was fundamentally unstable. Had to dismiss 3 more administrators this morning for accepting payments during Voss's network operations. That's 17 dismissed this month. At this rate, we'll run out of experienced officials before we finish investigating all the corruption. So hire inexperienced ones who are clean. I tried. They don't know how to actually administer territories. Good intentions don't translate to competent governance. We've got villages where tax collection has completely broken down, because the new collectors don't understand the existing systems. Roads that aren't being maintained because the officials managing infrastructure didn't document their processes before we arrested them for corruption. It's a mess. Alara was quiet for a moment. Then, my father would have found this frustrating too. He wanted dramatic change, immediate justice. But I think he would have eventually realized that fixing broken systems is harder than exposing them. Your father didn't live long enough to face that reality. Cedric's voice was rougher than he intended. He got to die believing that truth would automatically create positive change. We're living with the messy reality that truth just creates chaos that has to be carefully managed into something functional. You sound like you regret exposing Voss. No. He turned to face her directly. I regret that exposing corruption turned out to be the easy part. The hard part is building something better from the wreckage. And I'm not sure I'm qualified for that kind of construction. I'm good at tearing things down. Always have been. But building? That requires patience and compromise and accepting incremental progress. Those aren't exactly my strengths. Then learn them. Alara's voice was sharp. You wanted justice to matter more than convenience. Congratulations. Now you get to do the actual work of making that sustainable instead of just making speeches about principles. It's not dramatic. It doesn't feel like heroism. But it's what actually changes things permanently, instead of just creating chaos that eventually reverts to the same corruption under different names. She was right, of course. The recognition didn't make it less frustrating. How's your investigation going? Cedric asked, changing subjects. Alara had taken over formal inquiry into her father's death, using authority granted by the king to access records that had been sealed or destroyed. She'd been working for months trying to piece together exactly what had happened during Edmund Fenwick's final days, who'd been involved, and whether any justice remained possible for people who'd participated in his elimination. Slowly. Most of the key witnesses are dead or have fled the kingdom. I've got testimony from 3 people who admit to participating peripherally, but none of them can identify who actually gave the final order to kill him. She paused. I found his body, though, or what remains of it. Voss had him buried in an unmarked grave outside the capital. Took 2 months of following payment records to find the location. I'm sorry. Don't be. At least now I can give him proper burial, can acknowledge that he existed and that what happened to him was murder rather than mysterious disappearance. She looked at Cedric. That's more than most families get when powerful people decide someone needs to vanish. The weight of that truth settled between them like smoke from fires that had burned down everything comfortable and familiar. Edmund Fenwick would get a grave and recognition. Marcus would be remembered as a hero who'd died serving justice. The dozens of others who'd been eliminated by Voss's network over 20 years would maybe get their names carved into memorials if investigators could even confirm their deaths weren't actually accidents. It wasn't enough. Would never be enough. But enough didn't exist when you were trying to provide justice for systematic murder conducted by people who'd made eliminating evidence into professional competence. You should come to the memorial service, Alara said, for my father and Captain Thorne and all the others. Princess Mira is organizing something at the capital next month. Public acknowledgement of what they sacrificed. I'll be there. Cedric turned back to the valley. Though I'm not sure I deserve to be memorialized alongside people who actually gave their lives for the cause. I survived. That's not heroism. That's just luck and stubbornness. You survived because you refused to compromise even when compromising would have been easier. That's exactly the quality worth memorializing. She moved to stand beside him. Stop punishing yourself for still being alive. Marcus wouldn't want that. My father wouldn't want that. They died so this kingdom could be better. Don't waste their sacrifice by treating your survival like something shameful. The words hit harder than Cedric expected. He'd spent 6 months carrying guilt that felt appropriate given how many people had died while he continued breathing. Guilt that suggested he should have died instead of Marcus or Edmund, or the dozens of nameless officials who'd been eliminated for getting too close to truth. But guilt was just another form of self-indulgence when it prevented you from actually doing the work that justified survival. Marcus and Edmund hadn't died so Cedric could spend years feeling bad about being alive. They'd died so corruption could be exposed and justice could matter again, even if that mattering was messy and incomplete and required constant maintenance. The least he could do was honor that sacrifice by actually implementing change instead of wallowing in survivor's guilt that accomplished nothing except making him feel appropriately tragic. You're right, he said finally. I've been so focused on how hard reconstruction is that I haven't acknowledged how much has actually changed. Voss is dead. Her network is dismantled. Corrupt officials are facing consequences. The system isn't perfect, but it's better than it was 6 months ago, and that matters even if it doesn't feel like enough. Progress is always incremental. Alara's voice was softer now. My father spent 10 years investigating corruption and died before seeing any justice. You've spent 6 months implementing reforms that will outlast both of us if they're maintained properly. That's not failure. That's exactly what success looks like when you're trying to change institutions rather than just make dramatic gestures. A guard approached from the administrative building. Duke Ravenscar, Princess Mira has arrived from the capital. She's requesting immediate meeting. Cedric exchanged glances with Alara. The princess rarely traveled to northern territories without significant reason. Either something had gone catastrophically wrong in the capital, or something surprisingly positive had developed that required his attention. They walked back to the building where Princess Mira waited in his office. She looked tired in ways that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with spending 6 months discovering exactly how corrupt her father's administration had been. Every week brought new revelations about officials who'd participated in Voss's network, and each revelation required decisions about prosecution versus amnesty that had no clear right answers. "Your Highness," Cedric gestured for her to sit. "What brings you north?" Princess Mira remained standing. "Multiple things. First, the trials are complete. We've prosecuted 73 officials for participation in Chancellor Voss's corruption network. 47 received prison sentences, 22 were executed, 4 were pardoned in exchange for testimony that helped convict others. That's more prosecutions than I expected. My father decided that accountability mattered more than administrative continuity." He paused. "It's cost him significant political support from nobles who benefited from the old system. There are rumors of organized opposition forming among territory lords who think the reforms have gone too far. Opposition is inevitable when you threaten people's comfortable arrangements." Cedric moved to the window overlooking the valley. "The question is whether your father will maintain commitment to justice when that commitment becomes politically expensive." "He will." Princess Mira's voice was firm. "He's appointed me as primary administrator for continuing investigations and reforms, given me authority to prosecute corruption wherever it's found, regardless of political consequences. That's significant trust. It's recognition that someone needs to maintain pressure on systems that naturally drift back toward corruption when oversight relaxes." She moved to stand beside him. "Which brings me to the second reason for my visit. My father wants you to return to the capital permanently, to serve as royal advisor for institutional reform, with authority to investigate and prosecute corruption throughout the kingdom." Cedric turned to look at her. "That's the position Voss held, with significantly different mandate and oversight. You'd report directly to my father and me. Your investigations would be reviewed by independent judiciary rather than being subject to political influence. And you'd have resources to actually implement reforms instead of just coordinating responses to crises. It was everything he should have wanted. Official authority to continue the work that had consumed 6 months. Recognition that systematic change required sustained effort rather than just dramatic exposure of wrongdoing. Opportunity to ensure that Marcus and Edmund and all the others hadn't died just to create temporary disruption that would fade once public attention moved elsewhere. And Cedric felt nothing but exhaustion at the prospect. "Your Highness, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not qualified to serve as royal advisor. I'm qualified to tear down corrupt systems through violence and investigation. Building replacement systems requires different skills that I don't possess and probably can't develop. You're selling yourself short. No, I'm being realistic about my limitations." He gestured at the administrative building behind them. "I've spent 6 months trying to govern these territories and barely managed to prevent complete dysfunction. Expanding that responsibility to the entire kingdom would be disaster. You need someone who actually understands institutional construction, not someone who's just good at destroying things that need destroying." Princess Mira was silent for a long moment. Then, what if the position wasn't about building? What if it was specifically about maintaining oversight? About being the person who asks uncomfortable questions and refuses to accept comfortable lies when institutions start drifting back toward corruption? That's just being professionally suspicious of everyone. Exactly. She smiled slightly. The kingdom doesn't need another administrator who will make compromises to keep systems functioning. We have plenty of those. What we need is someone who will maintain pressure on those systems, who will investigate when things seem too smooth, who will prosecute powerful people even when prosecution is politically inconvenient. She paused. "You're not qualified to build institutions, but you're extremely qualified to ensure institutions remain accountable. That's a different role, but equally necessary." Cedric considered this proposal. It made sense in ways that felt uncomfortable because it meant accepting that his strengths were inherently destructive rather than constructive, that he was good at tearing down corruption but not at building replacements, that his value came from being perpetually suspicious and unwilling to accept easy answers rather than from any positive vision of governance. It was a depressing self-assessment, but depression didn't make it inaccurate. "I'll consider the offer," he said finally. "But I need time to finish work here first. These territories were hollowed out by 20 years of systematic theft. They need sustained attention before I can responsibly hand them off to someone else. Take whatever time you need. Princess Mira moved toward the door. The position will remain open until you're ready. She paused. One more thing. We've been reviewing records from House Ravenscar during your father's administration. The allegations Chancellor Voss made about your brother's death and your family's involvement in corruption networks. Cedric felt something cold settle in his chest. And they were partially accurate. Your father did participate in arrangements with northern mining operations that violated Crown tax policy. He did suppress investigation into those arrangements when your brother discovered them. She met his eyes. But your brother's death was suicide. The autopsy Voss showed you was authentic up to a point, but she falsified the conclusions to suggest murder when the evidence actually supported self-inflicted poisoning. So my father was corrupt, but not a murderer. Your father was a pragmatist who made compromises that looked like corruption if examined without context. Your brother was an idealist who couldn't reconcile his family's behavior with his principles and chose death over living with that knowledge. Princess Mira's voice was gentle. Neither of them were monsters. They were just people trying to navigate power structures that punished idealism and rewarded compromise. The same structures were now trying to reform. The information should have been devastating. Confirmation that his family had been complicit in the same corruption he'd spent 6 months fighting. That his brother had died because he'd discovered truths about House Ravenscar that violated everything he believed noble families should represent. Instead, Cedric just felt tired. Tired of revelations that complicated simple narratives. Tired of discovering that everyone was compromised and that purity was just another comfortable lie. People told themselves to avoid acknowledging how deeply embedded corruption was in every institution. Thank you for the information, he said quietly. At least now I know the full truth instead of just Voss's weaponized version of it. Truth is rarely as dramatic as we want it to be. The princess opened the door. But it's still worth knowing even when it's disappointing. After she left, Cedric stood at the window for a long time watching the valley as afternoon light shifted toward evening. Elara had disappeared somewhere, probably back to her father's investigation or to administrative work that never seemed to end no matter how many hours you threw at it. He thought about his brother, dead 15 years, who'd chosen suicide over living in a family that compromised principles for political advantage. Thought about his father, who'd made those compromises believing they were necessary for maintaining House Ravenscar's position. Thought about himself, who'd spent 20 years accepting similar compromises before 5 weeks of being dead had finally broken. Whatever internal mechanism allowed people to rationalize corruption as just practical governance, there was a pattern there. A cycle where each generation made compromises that seemed necessary, and each generation produced idealists who couldn't accept those compromises and either died fighting them or became the next generation of pragmatists making new compromises that their children would eventually rebel against. Maybe that cycle was just human nature asserting itself through institutional structures. Maybe you couldn't break it permanently, only delay the next iteration by maintaining enough pressure that corruption took longer to rebuild after being exposed. That was a depressing philosophy. But depression didn't make it wrong. The door opened again. Elara returned carrying documents. Found something interesting in the archives. Records from 23 years ago showing that Chancellor Voss originally came to power by exposing her predecessor's corruption. She ran on a platform of institutional reform and transparency. She paused. She was us, Cedric. 23 years ago, she was doing exactly what we're doing now, fighting corruption, exposing systematic theft, promising that justice would matter more than political convenience. And then she became exactly what she'd fought against, slowly, probably imperceptibly at first. A small compromise here, a necessary accommodation there, each one seeming reasonable individually, but compounding into the same corruption she'd originally opposed. Elara set down the documents. That's what scares me. Not that we'll fail to implement reforms, but that we'll succeed and then spend 20 years gradually compromising those reforms until we become the next generation's corruption that needs exposing. It's a legitimate fear. Cedric turned from the window. The question is what we do about it. We build in safeguards. Systems of oversight that function independently of whoever's in power. Regular investigations that assume corruption is present rather than waiting for dramatic exposure. A culture that treats institutional skepticism as necessary rather than as disloyalty. She moved closer.
We can't prevent corruption entirely because humans will always find ways to abuse power.
But we can make that abuse harder and consequences more immediate. Make the cycle happen faster so each generation of corruption doesn't get 20 years to entrench before being challenged. That's a more optimistic vision than I expected from you. It's not optimism. It's pragmatic acceptance that permanent solutions don't exist, and the best we can do is create systems that fail more gracefully and recover more quickly. She met his eyes.
You're not going to build a perfect kingdom, Cedric. No one is. But you can build one that's more resistant to corruption than what existed before.
That's worth attempting even if it's inevitably temporary.
The words resonated in ways that felt uncomfortable because they required accepting that his work would never be finished. That exposing Voss hadn't solved corruption,
just created opportunity to implement reforms that would themselves need defending against future compromise. That he'd spend the rest of his life fighting the same battles in different forms, never achieving permanent victory, but hopefully delaying the next collapse long enough that some good was accomplished before institutions rotted from within again. It was exhausting to contemplate. But exhaustion was just the price of caring about outcomes that extended beyond your own lifetime. "I'll take the princess's offer," he said. "Return to the capital and serve as professional skeptic, asking uncomfortable questions until someone decides I'm too inconvenient and arranges an accident that looks natural enough to avoid creating martyr." That's morbidly realistic. I've spent 6 months learning that morbid realism is just what optimism looks like after it survives contact with governance. Elara smiled despite everything. "My father would have liked you, eventually. After you both spent 10 years arguing about methodology and appropriate use of violence in pursuit of justice. Your father would have been horrified by most of my decisions, probably. But he would have respected that you made them for the right reasons, even when the methods were questionable." She paused. He believed that integrity mattered more than perfection, that trying to do right and failing was better than not trying, because failure seemed inevitable. Cedric felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, but recognition that maybe survival had purpose beyond just continuing to breathe. That Marcus and Edmund and his brother and all the others who'd died hadn't wasted their lives fighting battles that couldn't be permanently won. They'd bought time for reforms that might delay the next corruption cycle, might create conditions where the next generation of idealists didn't have to start from zero when they inevitably discovered that power structures had rotted from within again. That wasn't victory, but it was meaning. And meaning was all anyone could really create in systems that naturally drifted toward corruption through human nature's inability to resist temptation when oversight weakened. The sun was setting over the valley, painting the northern territories in shades of orange and purple that made everything look more dramatic than daily reality ever felt. Cedric watched the light fade and thought about the work waiting in the capital. Investigations that would consume years. Prosecutions that would create enemies. The constant pressure of maintaining skepticism when exhaustion pushed toward accepting comfortable lies that made governance feel less overwhelming. It was going to be difficult, frustrating, frequently demoralizing. Exactly the kind of work that ground people down until they either quit or became the next generation's corruption problem. But someone had to do it. Someone had to maintain pressure on systems that naturally relaxed toward abuse when oversight disappeared. Someone had to ask uncomfortable questions and refuse easy answers and prosecute powerful people, even when prosecution created political complications. That someone might as well be the person who'd already died twice and had nothing left to lose except integrity that felt increasingly like the only thing worth protecting. Cedric turned from the window. "Let's finish the work here and then head to the capital. Time to see if professional skepticism can be sustainable long enough to actually matter. And if it can't, then we fail trying, which is better than not trying because failure seemed inevitable." Elara's words, Edmund's philosophy, the belief that attempting justice mattered even when permanent success was impossible. It would have to be enough. The memorial service took place 3 weeks later in the capital's central square. Thousands attended, drawn by news reports about corruption exposure and the officials who died fighting systematic injustice. Princess Mira gave a speech about sacrifice and institutional reform. King Aldrich spoke about learning from betrayal and committing to accountability. Various nobles said appropriate things about heroes and justice and the importance of integrity in governance. Cedric stood in the crowd and watched names being carved into stone. Edmund Fenwick, Marcus Thorne, 37 others who'd been eliminated by Voss's network over 20 years. each name representing a person who'd tried to serve honestly and died because honesty threatened people who'd built power through corruption. The ceremony was moving in ways that felt manipulative because all ceremonies were manipulation dressed as sincerity. But manipulation in service of remembering people who deserved remembering felt more acceptable than most government theater. When the formal speeches ended, Cedric made his way to the memorial stone and stood before Marcus's name. He didn't have anything profound to say. No dramatic declaration about honoring sacrifice or ensuring death had meaning. Just stood there acknowledging that his friend was gone, and that absence mattered even if absence was all death really was.
Alara appeared beside him. She didn't say anything either.
Just stood there looking at her father's name and processing grief that probably wouldn't ever fully resolve no matter how much justice was achieved or how many reforms were implemented. They stood in silence while the crowd dispersed around them, thousands of people returning to lives that would continue regardless of whether corruption was exposed or reforms were maintained. Most wouldn't think about systematic injustice until it affected them personally. That was human nature asserting itself through comfortable ignorance that made daily life manageable. Cedric couldn't fault them for it. He'd lived the same way for 20 years, accepting corruption as inevitable background noise that didn't require his attention as long as his own position remained secure. The only difference now was that he'd seen behind the comfortable lies and couldn't unsee the machinery that ground people into statistics when they threatened powerful interests. Couldn't pretend that injustice was someone else's problem when he'd watched good people die for trying to fix it. That knowledge was a burden he'd carry until the day someone decided he was too inconvenient and arranged his third death in ways that finally stuck. But burdens were just the price of awareness. And awareness was what separated people who tried to change things from people who just accepted whatever systems they were born into. "We should go," Alara said finally. "Princess Mira is hosting a private gathering for people who actually worked on the investigation. Less formal than this ceremony. More honest about what we're actually trying to accomplish. Lead the way." They walked through the capital's streets toward the palace. The city looked prosperous in ways that hid how many people were struggling because prosperity was always unevenly distributed, and the people suffering most were least visible to those comfortable enough to not look too closely. That was another problem worth addressing. Systematic inequality that created conditions where corruption flourished because desperate people accepted small compromises to survive, while powerful people accumulated more advantages through connections that operated outside official channels. But that problem would take generations to address and required different skills than exposing corruption. Cedric could maintain pressure on institutions to reduce theft. He couldn't redesign economic systems to create genuinely equitable distribution of resources. That required vision he didn't possess and political will that no individual could generate alone. So he'd focus on what he could affect: prosecute corrupt officials, investigate suspicious arrangements, refuse to accept comfortable explanations when evidence suggested something more complicated beneath the surface, maintain skepticism as professional practice rather than personal failing. It wasn't revolutionary, but revolution rarely produced sustainable change anyway. Better to pursue incremental reform that actually lasted than dramatic transformation that collapsed under its own impossibility. The private gathering was held in a garden behind the palace where Princess Mira had arranged informal meeting space. Maybe 20 people attended, all of them directly involved in investigating or prosecuting Voss's network. Judges who'd reviewed corrupted cases, investigators who'd traced stolen money, accountants who'd untangled falsified records. The people doing actual work rather than just making speeches about justice. Princess Mira greeted them at the entrance. "Duke Ravenscar, Lady Fennec, thank you for coming." She gestured toward tables where food and wine were arranged with less formality than state dinners required. This is meant to be acknowledgement of work that usually goes unrecognized. The people who spend years doing difficult things that don't generate headlines but actually change how institutions function. Cedric accepted wine and moved to where a group of investigators were discussing ongoing cases. The conversation was technical, focused on specific challenges in tracing payments through multiple intermediaries designed to obscure original sources. Not dramatic, not particularly interesting to anyone outside the field, but essential to actually recovering stolen assets rather than just acknowledging theft had occurred. He listened more than he spoke, recognizing that these people understood institutional investigation better than he ever would. His contribution had been dramatic exposure through violence and survival against odds. Their contribution was patient accumulation of evidence through procedures designed to produce legally defensible conclusions rather than just compelling narratives. Both approaches mattered, but sustainable reform required the latter more than the former, and Cedric was slowly accepting that his role was becoming less relevant as the investigation shifted from dramatic exposure to careful documentation. That recognition should have been troubling. Instead, it felt almost relieving. He didn't have to be the center of everything, didn't have to maintain the intensity that had kept him alive during 5 weeks of survival. Could step back into a supporting role where his skepticism and refusal to accept easy answers served as check on people doing actual reconstruction work. The gathering continued through the evening with conversations that were more honest than formal ceremonies allowed. People acknowledged frustration with how slowly reform progressed, discussed officials who'd escaped prosecution through political connections, debated whether achieving 80% reduction in corruption was success or failure when perfect elimination had been the public promise. Cedric found himself drawn to these conversations in ways that formal speeches never engaged him. The messiness felt more real than polish. The admission of limited success felt more honest than declarations of complete victory. The recognition that work would continue long after public attention faded felt more sustainable than assuming dramatic exposure automatically created permanent change. This was what actual reform looked like. Not heroes and villains and climactic confrontations, just people grinding away at complicated problems that resisted simple solutions, making incremental progress, accepting setbacks, maintaining effort even when outcomes felt inadequate compared to the scope of original problems. It was unglamorous, exhausting, frequently demoralizing, and absolutely necessary if anything was going to change in ways that lasted beyond the next crisis. As the evening wound down, Cedric found himself standing alone at the edge of the garden, looking back toward the memorial stone visible in the distance. The names carved into it represented people who'd believed truth mattered enough to die for. Whether their deaths actually created the change they'd hoped for was still uncertain, would remain uncertain for years as reforms either took root or gradually eroded back toward comfortable corruption. Princess Mira approached from behind. "You're leaving again." It wasn't a question. She'd learned to read his patterns over 6 months of working together. "Back to the Northern Territories tomorrow morning," he confirmed. "Want to finish transitioning administration before accepting your father's offer to return permanently. Should take another few weeks. Take whatever time you need." She moved to stand beside him. "The work will still be here when you return. Corruption doesn't solve itself just because we had one successful prosecution. That's a depressing guarantee of job security. It's realistic assessment of institutional dynamics." She paused. "My father asked me to tell you something. He said he's spent 40 years learning how to maintain power, but he's never learned how to actually deserve it. He thinks maybe that's the difference between you and most nobles. You stopped worrying about maintaining power and started worrying about deserving it. That's generous interpretation of me burning down my entire life through stubborn refusal to compromise. Perhaps. Or perhaps it's recognition that deserving power matters more than maintaining it. That legitimacy comes from serving honestly, rather than from accumulating authority." Cedric thought about that. About 20 years spent maintaining power through calculated pragmatism. About 5 weeks spent losing everything and discovering that survival without integrity felt worse than death with purpose. About 6 months spent trying to rebuild institutions in ways that prioritized justice over convenience, even when convenience would have been easier. He still wasn't sure he deserved anything, but at least he was trying to act in ways that might eventually earn legitimacy rather than just demanding it through force or inherited position. That was progress. Small, incremental, barely noticeable day to day, but meaningful when measured over months and years, rather than seeking dramatic transformation that reality consistently proved was impossible. "Tell your father I appreciate the confidence, and that I'll do my best to maintain skepticism without becoming so cynical that I stop believing change is possible. That's all anyone can ask." Princess Mira turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. We recovered personal effects from Chancellor Voss's estate. Found a journal she'd kept for 23 years documenting her campaign against corruption that eventually became the corruption she'd originally fought." She glanced back. "Would you like to read it? Might be instructive to understand how someone becomes what they hate." Cedric felt cold recognition settle in his chest. "Yes,
I should probably understand that trajectory since I'm potentially on the same path. We all are. The princess's voice was soft. That's why we need people watching for the signs. People willing to expose the next generation's corruption, even when that corruption wears familiar faces. She left, and Cedric remained in the garden as night settled over the capital. Thousands of lives continuing in the city below. Most of them unaware that systematic corruption had been exposed and prosecuted. Most of them not caring as long as their immediate circumstances remained tolerable. That was fine. Governance didn't require everyone caring about institutional integrity. It just required enough people caring that pressure remained constant on systems that naturally drifted toward abuse. Cedric had become one of those people. Not through choice exactly, but through circumstances that had stripped away comfortable lies and forced him to confront how deeply broken power structures actually were. He'd survived by maintaining that uncomfortable awareness, by refusing to accept easy answers when evidence suggested something more complicated beneath the surface, by prosecuting corruption even when prosecution created enemies who would eventually arrange accidents that looked natural enough to avoid creating martyrs. It wasn't the life he had imagined 20 years ago when Duke Ravenscar meant unquestioned authority and comfortable certainty about his place in the world. But it was the life he'd earned through survival that had ground away everything except core principles he'd discovered only existed when everything else was stripped away. Marcus would have approved. Edmund would have understood. His brother would have recognized the pattern of choosing integrity over survival, even when survival seemed like the rational choice. That recognition mattered more than titles or formal authority or dramatic memorials that turned real people into stone names that future generations would eventually forget. It mattered because it meant that even when everything fell apart and systems collapsed and corruption inevitably rebuilt itself under new names, there would be people who remembered that resistance was possible, that exposure created consequences. That truth occasionally mattered more than power, even if that mattering was temporary and required constant maintenance to prevent backsliding. Cedric left the garden and walked through the palace toward rooms that had been provided for his use during visits to the capital. The corridors were quiet, most people having retired for the evening. He moved through empty spaces that felt haunted by everyone who'd served here over centuries. Nobles who'd built careers through compromise. Officials who'd chosen comfortable corruption over difficult integrity. The accumulated weight of human nature asserting itself through institutional structures that punished idealism and rewarded pragmatism. He was part of that pattern now. Another person trying to change systems, while systems worked to change him into someone who'd eventually accept corruption as inevitable. The cycle Alara had identified. The transformation that had turned Voss from reformer into the embodiment of everything she'd originally fought against. The only defense was awareness. Constant vigilance against the small compromises that seemed reasonable individually, but compounded into systematic corruption. Regular examination of whether methods had become ends. Honest assessment of whether he was still serving justice or just maintaining his own position through increasingly questionable means. That awareness wouldn't prevent eventual corruption, but it might delay it long enough that some good was accomplished before he became the next generation's problem requiring exposure and prosecution. It would have to be enough. Because enough was all anyone could really achieve when fighting human nature's tendency toward abuse through power structures designed by equally flawed humans, trying to organize societies that resisted organization. Cedric reached his rooms and collapsed into bed, still wearing clothes he'd worn to the memorial service. Exhaustion pulled him toward sleep that would be interrupted by nightmares about people he'd failed to save and decisions that had. Seemed necessary at the time, but looked increasingly questionable through hindsight that revealed consequences invisible in the moment. But tomorrow would bring new investigations, new prosecutions, new compromises that felt necessary and might be justified or might be the first steps toward becoming what he'd fought against. The work would continue. The cycle would persist. The only question was how long he could maintain integrity before circumstances forced compromises that transformed him into someone unrecognizable. He fell asleep without answers because answers didn't exist, just choices made daily about whether to accept comfortable lies or pursue uncomfortable truth, whether to rationalize necessary compromises or resist even when resistance seemed pointless, whether to maintain skepticism or allow exhaustion to create acceptance that corruption was just how things worked. Tomorrow, he'd make those choices again, and the day after, and every day, until circumstances or enemies or simple exhaustion finally ended the campaign that had started with dying in a tunnel and somehow continued through.
6 months of discovering that survival was harder than death, when survival required constant effort to maintain principles that reality consistently tried to erode. It wasn't victory, but it was meaning. And meaning was the only thing worth protecting when everything else proved temporary and subject to corruption through human nature's inability to resist temptation when oversight weakened. That would have to be enough. And somehow, against all probability and good sense, it was.